The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the History Things podcast. I am your host, Pat McGuire, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Matt Borders. Matty B, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, man. It's July, we're getting close to battle anniversary, so things are pretty busy around here.
Yeah, I imagine the spring and summer, early summer have been beating you up pretty good. So make sure that you get out to Matt's site with the Park Service, the federal one that we don't want to say directly, but make sure you go out there and support the battlefield and all that stuff. So quick note before we get into things tonight, just remember that the History Things podcast is sponsored by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Use our promo code HISTORYTHINGS and get yourself 10% off your next purchase. Why pay full price? We are history nerds giving you a discount. Use it. I'm excited, man. This topic that we got tonight is a pretty natural handoff from the last time we hung out on the Western Front, in quarter 4 of season 2 with Jonathan Bracken, where we spent a lot of time in Verdun following the 151 Regiment. I think some of our listeners are probably still there right now. But we spent a ton of time slogging through the mud, you could say there. And today, since this is the start of the second half, it's July 1st, we wanted to focus on the Somme a little bit, which is another great campaign, great battle of the First World War. That is basically, it happens as a direct response to what's going on in Verdun. Tonight, we have a really cool guest with us who's going to basically talk to us about some of the action. We're going to focus maybe on some of the Canadian aspects of this, which you know me, I love good Canadian First World War stories. And we're going to talk about some of the weaponry and things that were used throughout the Somme campaign, the battle and all that stuff. So joining us today, you might be familiar with this channel on YouTube, British Muzzleloaders, is the man himself, Rob. How you doing, buddy? Welcome to the History Things podcast.
I'm doing just fine. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely, our pleasure, man. It's a lot of excitement in the air when we come to the Western Front, which despite that, 100 years ago, nobody really was excited to go to the Western Front, but we like talking about it and things like that. So what we want to do tonight, we'll set the stage for our listeners here real quick, is we're going to set some context. We'll talk about, some of the planning and all that stuff. We're not getting into the actual unit level. So if you're looking for specific stories about Manchester Pals and all that other stuff, We'll do that at another day. What we want to do is make sure we just connect you to some basics and get you understanding what happened for the British Expeditionary Force and its Dominion forces during the summer of 1916. So Rob, for me, when I first got into the First World War, it was following a Canadian unit, the 85th Highlander Battalion, and they show up in February of 1917. And they're assigned to the 4th Division of the British Army and things like that. And so they are a fresh unit in the late winter and then spring of 1917, but they're a part of now an overall division that has just wrapped up its time during the campaign of the Somme. And I felt that there was no way I was going to understand what my focus of research was walking into unless I started to look backwards. So I actually started to study the Somme retroactively, which, took me to Verdun, where we talked to John and things like that. But I found the Somme kind of fascinating because of the amount of things that you recognize from early and late war, but some of the things that hadn't really shown up yet, like these ungodly artillery barrages and things like that. I know that the firepower of the war is really what your specialty is. So can we just sort of set the stage, for how we get to, I guess the race to the sea, where we're still kind of fighting in the 19th century style. We're standing up, we're moving over the open ground really fast, things like that, versus these, dug down in the trenches, and we have these slogging attacks with these massive, massive bombardments. Can you sort of, I guess, get our listeners to that point, how we're doing that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Somme, I mean, you could tell by your enthusiasm about it that it holds such a place in the social history of the British Empire, let's call it that, as it was called back then. But, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the Dominions, which are now Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Australia, the forces of India as well. So it not only is it the middle of the war, essentially from 14 to 18 and 16 being in the middle, but it's the middle of the war in more ways than one, not just in terms of a calendar. But you brushed on a couple of topics there that illustrate that, and the fact that it forms this period of time between the early part and the late part, because this is the first time that the British and Empire forces come together in such scale, that the Somme is this first massive effort. And there's massive efforts after that, of course, and they build on the experience of the Somme, because the Somme in a greater experience is not perfect. And that sounds like a bit of an understatement to some, I'm sure. But there are so many fascinating aspects about the Somme that, when taken in the correct context, can be placed on that continuum. And you can see how the army takes the lessons from the Somme and moves forward into 1917 and 18, and ultimately victory. Leading up to the Somme, there is a period from 1914 until 1916 is this period of unprecedented growth in the British and Empire forces, both in their own respective countries, but also on the Western Front. And I think that leading into the Somme, it's really important to understand sort of what gets us here to the Somme. And quite frankly, that story, without taking it too far back, to perhaps encapsulate multiple podcasts, it actually is 1914, because in 1914, this old world is launched into a paradigm shifting event, a global event, and that, of course, being the Great War. So at the beginning in 1914, the forces of Britain and the Empire are the regular army, that these individuals have joined the army in a relatively stable and somewhat long service, but they joined it as a profession. And the British Army at the time has come out of the 19th century, the Victorian era, with a sort of empire policing role. And as we get past the Boer War of 1899 to 1902-ish, 1901, then we move into a period where the army, and Great Britain in particular, and the foreign policy starts to take notice of the possibility of fighting a continental power. Of course, this is Germany. And there's a whole bunch of aspects that come into that, the naval race and all that kind of thing. But moving into the Great War, once war is declared and the forces clash, the army of Great Britain is a regular army, a standing army. And the initial commitment is, by comparison to the other continental powers, minuscule. There's a famous phrase that's used as the old contemptibles, coming from the some would say the mythical writings of indicating that it was a contemptible little army, contemptible in its size and its ability to influence things on the battlefield. That was taken to heart by the veterans of that era, and they became known as given the self moniker, as it were, the old contemptibles. So those initial battles in 1914, the initial clash at Mons and Le Cateau, and moving back towards the fighting on the Aisne, and then, as you mentioned briefly, the race to the sea, which begins at the Battle of the Marne, which then sort of the counterattack, the push back against the German armies, and the repositioning of forces all the way up north towards the English Channel and the North Sea. So what ends up happening is the British Expeditionary Force, growing modestly during that time, but still just a handful of divisions formed into 3 corps about, take a position up on essentially the left flank of now this contiguous line from the ocean to Switzerland. But it's a very small piece. once those initial clashes ending at the Battle of Ypres, the first Battle of Ypres in November 1914, then and over the sort of the winter, things are relatively stable. But there's a number of things that are put in place, predominantly by one man in particular, Lord Kitchener. And he, not to say that he's exclusive in his thoughts, but certainly is a driving force behind the decisions that he implements, is the fact that this is not going to be a war that is quote unquote over by Christmas. And in order to fight this war that he sees as being a great long undertaking, he needs manpower. Now, the British Army at the time, again, mentioned the regular British Army, those that take that as a profession. But in Britain, we also have another army, essentially, and this is the Territorial Army. And this army is made up of volunteers. It's predominantly formed for home defense in the greater scheme of things, allowing the regular army then to fight in an expeditionary role, wherever that may be. In this case, it now becomes the continent.
Would this be like National Guard or militia forces here in the States?
Yeah, I would say National Guard would be the best way to put it. They're part-time soldiers. Most of them have civilian jobs. They're strongly supported. Well, that's a figurative term, but they are supported by the regular army as far as key personnel, commanders, senior NCOs at varying levels within the organization of the Territorial Army. And I only mention this because this is part of the framework leading towards the Somme, because it's important to realize that this Territorial Army is this other army, this other entity. And in the pre-war world, it's actually not part of the British Army. It's patronized and it's supported by the counties.
So when we're talking about, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was saying when we're talking about the British force, that if they land, the Germans they're gonna have them arrested. That's 300,000 strong roughly. Is that just the regular army, or is that combined with the territorial force at that point?
So the British Expeditionary Force is around 100,000 men that lands in France in 1914. The Territorial Army, and the numbers, I'm sorry, I don't have them at hand right now, but it's many, many thousands, and it's a large chunk. But because the Territorial Army is dedicated for home defense in the event of an invasion by Germany or another power for that matter. But what happens, and you often see them in photographs, especially from the early part of the war, is that the Territorial Army almost to a man volunteers for foreign service or overseas service. And you'll see often when we talk of pictures of various territorial battalions and men, is that they wear a small badge on their uniform just above their pocket. And this is the way that they are indicate to other people within the system that they are volunteers, that they are willing to forego the home service only rule and be deployed elsewhere in an expeditionary fashion. So in 1915, what you see, of course, the first and famous commitment of a territorial battalion is at that Battle of First Ypres in 1914, and a battalion known as the London Scottish, which is a battalion of the London Regiment. But they are the first territorial battalion into action, and it doesn't go too well for them. But we're in times now where we can see this, our regular army, we need more people here. We need more forces. They're being ground down in the nature of the fighting at the time, and we need more units. And which unit happens to be first in line? The London Scottish. And they attack at Messines, just south of Ypres. This being a site of a famous battle, a famous pre-action of the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. Famously at Messines, there's mines that are exploded and whatnot. And it's very successful as a deliberate operation, but that's not part of this story.
We'll get to 1917. Everybody hold your horses. We'll get there.
We'll get there
eventually.
And I appreciate people's patience in walking through this piece of it here, is that we see this early commitment which builds of the territorial army in France and Belgium for that matter. And we see in the battles, particularly Loos in 1915 is generally accepted to be the first sort of major action undertaken by a large chunk by territorial divisions. And it has some success and some, well, less than success, as well as many of these battles that we go through have this yin and yang to them. Some of them, battles in early 1915, the Chapelle, for example, they seem to have cracked the code. There's a rapid hurricane bombardment at Neuve Chapelle, and the initial successes are startling, but the follow-up piece to that, the support of the attacking forces once they've accomplished their objectives, and the mitigation of the all-important German counterattack, those pieces haven't been learned yet, how to get over those. So this period of 1915 sees in the field the introduction of not only the territorial army of Great Britain, but you also see then, as we mentioned earlier, is the commitment of Dominion forces and Empire forces, particularly from India, Canada, Australia, not so much Australia, New Zealand yet, but they, of course, will play a large role in the fighting on the Somme. But 1915 is this building period. And part of that building period is, and it's odd to sort of the modern mind who would think of a national army being just one entity. But Kitchener calls, and famously, and everyone I'm sure is familiar with that famous poster with his face and his finger pointing, saying, "Britain, your country needs you," essentially. This is part of a campaign. He figures he needs 100,000 men to augment. But what happens is this flood of volunteers that come, civilian volunteers that say there's a war on, and they respond to this appeal. So what we end up having, Kitchener was famously very derisive of the territorial army, thinking that they were not perhaps where he wanted to put the focus and emphasis as far as building the BEF. That said, they are an integral part of it. What Kitchener does is he institutes this system and calls for volunteers, which at the point of sale, as it were, completely overwhelm the ability of the establishment, the institution of the army to handle this number of people. Famously, his name is attached to this group of people, which eventually form units and divisions. Kitchener battalions, Kitchener's men,
Kitchener's
the
army.
first
Yeah.
K1, K2, K3, which are terms that are used to describe the first 100,000 recruits. And on the surface, this is unbelievably successful. But as the short to intermediate timeframes sort of elongate, there's a huge issue with this, because the bulk of the regular army is fighting in France. The territorial army, which is just being able to just sort of get itself up and running and deploy divisions to the field. But this leaves nobody to lead these hundreds of thousands of men that have now flocked to the colors, as they say. So in 1915, or starting in 1914, right off the get-go, we see through this period of sort of 18 months, as it were, as we lead into 1916, is this coalescing of thousands and thousands of men into an army, Kitchener's army, what becomes known as the New Army.
Right.
So what do you have by late 1915 is 3 armies in the field. If we don't count, for colloquial reasons, we don't count sort of the Dominion and Empire forces there, but British armies. We have the regular army, we have the territorial army, and now we have the New Army.
The volunteer
And
guys.
All right.
Yeah, I was saying the volunteer guys are out there now.
Right. But to say that it's a headache is grossly understating, because there are no weapons to give these people. There's all kinds of humanity seething and teeming with enthusiasm that they want to go and fight for their country and on to Berlin, as it were. But there's no weapons to give them, because the limited sort of industry that supported the pre-war army and the operations it undertook in Victorian times, sure, it could manage that. But there are no massive stockpiles of weapons and ammunition and uniforms or equipment. There just doesn't exist. So this new army is, for a huge period of time, once it's formed, is that they're in their civilian clothes, that they have to attend parades, and they have to start somehow becoming units and cohesive with a chain of command. There needs to be leaders. Well, where do these leaders come from? Well, there's the old guy down the street. He used to be a colonel in the army, but he retired in 1902. Well, get him out. We need him. Well, okay. Well, who are going to be the NCOs? Who are going to be the people that are going to instruct these people in the art of soldiering? From foot drill to how to handle their weapons, to how to put on their uniforms, to how to act and how to stand and how to drill and how to be in the army. Is that there's this huge gulf that exists of that very essential piece to forming an army. And as I say, on the surface, it looks fantastic. There's thousands of men flocking, ready to go, and they're full of enthusiasm. But then sort of reality hits, and then the institution of the army, the country, the sort of that total war hasn't manifested itself in industry yet.
And Rob, I'm glad you're touching on this, because for our listeners, a visual that you might have for this would be from the documentary They Shall Not Grow Old from a couple years back. There's some great scenes in that film of the new model army coming together, this mass of humanity that Rob's been talking about, and the fact that there's just not enough supplies. There's a number of these images and newsreels showing literally piles of clothing, and the corporals and sergeants are basically going to these new recruits, go through it and take what fits you. They're doing that with boots and hats and helmets, and it's a fascinating visual, and I'm really glad that you touched on this, Rob, because I think a lot of folks don't think about the logistics behind building these armies.
For sure.
I was
quickly mention, you mentioned new model army, and I don't want to harp, and I don't want to be that guy, but
be that guy.
Talk about the term new model army is actually an English Civil War era. So we're talking about 1600s, not
talking
not
Cromwell. Matt, you hit the wrong time machine button.
and that is completely my fault, and I do apologize.
The new model army is the genesis of the British Army, right? I mean, from the color of its red jackets to the continuous existence of units that in some cases exist to this day. So, but in the terms of Kitchener, it is termed the new army and new army divisions. Anyway, again, minor point.
No, we love that stuff. Do it. Go get them, Rob. Real quick, I have just a couple quick things I wrote down when I was sort of getting myself ready. I was blown away by this logistical sort of overwhelming moment as well. So just so everybody's sort of aware, Kitchener asked for like 100,000 volunteers. That's roughly the size of the Army of the Potomac around two of its greatest campaigns in the American Civil War. We're talking Antietam and Gettysburg. There's a lot more at Gettysburg, but they get within 30 to 60 days of this, public plea, there's 500,000 volunteers. So there are 400,000 more than they even asked for. And then I think it's within 4 to 6 months, they have 2 million volunteers when they only asked for 100,000. So, one of the things that Matt and I like to discuss is, and we're not going to do it, we'll tease it in this moment, but we won't get into it in this episode, is, why countries like England and France and even Germany to an extent have such a different reverence for this war than we do here in the States. And Matt and I agree, it's because in this moment we're talking about, everybody in this country was suddenly at war. The industry, the home front, the front line, the old timers. It was a national thing. And for us here in the States, unfortunately, the First World War was just something else we were involved in. And a century after the fact, it's kind of how it gets remembered. But I got overwhelmed because I was like, wow, they're only asking for 100,000, and then they get 500,000 within like a blink of an eye. How do you support all these guys? You don't. It's a mess getting off the ground, but it's impressive how quickly they did it.
You mentioned a mess getting off the ground. It's a complete mess. It really is. Every aspect of military life and an army in the building phase is deficient. Everything. So right off the bat, there has to be a new set of equipment developed, because the very modern set of equipment that the British Army has going into the war, the 1908 webbing set, again, cutting edge technology. It's the best set of equipment in the entire world. There just isn't enough of it. And the mills can't weave enough webbing and parts of it to build this army. So in 1914, they put out contracts to say, hey, look, in days of old, as it were, equipment was made out of leather, but can we replicate this to some degree? This new set of equipment, can we replicate this in leather? And they come up with the 1914 leather equipment. It differs in detail, but is an example of this expedient that needs to be taken in order to equip these thousands and hundreds of thousands of new men joining the army. This goes on in innumerable areas. Famously, much to the derision of the new soldiers in the new army, Kitchener's new army, is the fact there aren't any uniforms for them, and they want to join the army and be soldiers because this is what we're joining for. And for the vast majority of their early time, they're in civilian clothes, and then this system slowly begins to catch up. But there's no khaki material to make their service dress out of. So again, what do? Well, there's a whole bunch of blue material that we can use, blue wool, and we can design a really simple, functional, set of clothing, a tunic or a jacket and a pair of trousers. Okay, like we need to give them something to make them uniform and give them. Yeah. I mean, it's called a uniform for a reason, right?
Yeah, make them feel like they're in the military.
Exactly. And so what happens is Kitchener Blues enter service as this stopgap, this expedient. And it's just it looks very similar to some of the really expedient clothing that comes out of the American Civil War. The sack coats and the really, really functional, simple jackets and garments. It's very similar to that. And it's never intended for them to be used overseas, but it's something that we can get these guys into. So when they all form up on the parade square and learn their first steps in marching and turning and all that basic soldier stuff, at least they have a uniform. This takes time, however. The other piece is weaponry, is how do these new recruits, we don't have any rifles. And there are pictures of rifles from the 1880s, the first issues of the Lee Metford being found in armories, places, and in other warehouses and being brought out, which are far obsolete by the time of the Great War.
Right.
They would be familiar to anybody. It's a Lee action. It's the first sort of versions of what the rifle going into the Great War is in the short magazine, the Enfield. But they're doing what they can. They bring these old rifles out, and in some cases are issued sort of one to a company. Right? A company full strength is 200 men. So
Matt, it's your turn. You do the rifle drill tonight.
Well, that's it. I was just looking at a picture in one of the books in prepping for this a little bit, and there was a picture of a Kitchener, a platoon, let's call it a platoon, sort of 40 men, and they're in Kitchener Blues with their field service caps, little wedge caps, and they're in their blues. They're all super big smiles and all happy to be there. And there's one rifle, and the guy, it's like, your turn to hold it, pal. Get in the front for the picture. And there's a guy holding this Lee Metford, Mark I star Lee Metford. Which would have been, common in the 1890s, but not anymore. And that's the platoon rifle, because they'll have a chance holding it and learning how it works, because that's all there is. So I think it's important. And again, it all deals with the Somme. And this is where we're headed, is this foundation, this background to what we find in the summer of 1916, is that this building phase and this new army that is created from scratch. And I think that aspect sometimes is overlooked, especially at the sort of the interest level, if you will, rather than the academic level, which is, it's well understood there. But in terms of the general interest of the Great War, it's something that is often overlooked. And it's important to consider is that this army, which, and I'm talking about it now because it is much like Loos in 1915 is the territorial army's sort of real first, right, with large amounts of participation. The Somme is the first opportunity of the new army to sort of take its place as it were. And it's not exclusively new army, but it's in a huge part new army. And that's why we're talking about this as we move along through the timeline, in terms of where these guys have come from. And I think that to me, that's important, because it speaks to all kinds of things, their spirit, the morale, how they're organized into their units. Famously, there is a scheme where in the process of generating this mass of volunteers is the PALS, call it the program for lack of a better term, in that if you can come to the recruiting office and say, hey, look, I've got my pals here with me, and we're all bankers, or we're all this, or we're all that. If you join with your friends, they will guarantee that you serve with your friends. And this famously becomes the basis of what becomes known as the PALS battalions, the Accrington PALS. There's numerous PALS battalions, and they're called that colloquially because each one of these battalions belongs to an already existing regiment within the British Army. The Manchester Regiment, the King's Regiment, the Royal Scots. These are the regiments that make up the British Army, and they just simply add battalions to them. And there's some of these regiments have dozens of battalions by the end of the war. A large number of these are New Army battalions, and they get nicknames, especially when this PALS construct sort of manifests itself within these different units. So these men that are on the Somme, a lot of them have joined in 1914 in this, as you mentioned, this overwhelming surge of volunteerism. And they've undergone the rudimentary training. They've had to navigate, mind you, they've not known anything different. But they, and I say they, not at an individual level, but also at the unit level, the small unit level, the battalion. But it's one thing to have a battalion of 1,000 men that operates in their 4 companies of, sort of 150 or so, and trying to maneuver them. And what do we do when we're together, like in this relatively large group of men, but put them into brigades and divisions and corps. Like, we're talking about building this system with people that don't know anything about it, but trying somehow to inculcate the necessity, the necessary information about building mass continental-sized armies. And that's what the British Army is trying to do. So we talked a little bit about the fact that they have no weapons. We just mentioned small arms and rifles. Can you imagine trying to fabricate and train in other arms, particularly as it pertains to the Somme, is the artillery? Right. Well, like all the gun, the main effort of the artillery and the production capacity of the country is like most of it's already in France already. Well, where do these, we in a typical infantry division, and again, the Territorial Army had guns, some of them obsolete, but they already had them in hand. These new army, organizations, they just don't have them. And then to build the artillery units to support the infantry, and it's the infantry that the volunteers predominantly end up in, because that's the main component of any field army is its infantry, with the supporting arms being artillery, and to an extent in this war anyway, the cavalry, and the engineers and all those other pieces of the puzzle, as it were. But it's the infantry that predominates in terms of where these men end up. But these divisions that are eventually formed in a division, it's important, maybe just take a little sidebar here. We have battalions of about 1,000, and that's where we talk about the Accrington PALS, or the 14th Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, or whatever it is. Those are battalions of about 1,000 in terms of paper strength. You group them into 4s, 4 to a brigade, under the command of a brigadier general and a small staff. You take 3 brigades, and they make up a division. And at division level, you get the inject of all the supporting arms. There's an artillery brigade, or a group of artillery brigades that are attached to that division that become part of that division. And a division becomes the largest permanent unit within the army. Divisions are grouped into corps, but corps, as we speak to the British forces, a corps level headquarters is a managerial function, which sees divisions come and go depending on what they're doing, where they are in the line, how important a role they're playing in a battle. A corps could have 2 divisions to it. A corps could have 4 divisions to it, depending on what it needs to do. But there's a very fluid nature within the British Army at corps level. And of course, army level is a grouping of corps. And at the time of the Somme in 1916, there's 4 armies. And by the end of it, there's 5. So you can see this exponential growth from the BEF in 1914 at the beginning of the war, and sort of Mons and Le Cateau. It's almost, a handful of divisions, 4 or 5, a cavalry division, right? That's it. There's 1 corps and there's 2 corps.
That's why they talk about if they land, they're going to have them arrested. Like their opposition doesn't even take them seriously on the field just by their size and numbers.
Right, and that's obviously is a famous aspect of 1914 fighting, the so-called rapier amongst size, is that what the British Army has, the regular British Army has, is its tactical prowess. It's very good in the field. Its soldiers understand fieldcraft. They can shoot very well. There's a number of aspects to it that sort of surprise people and give the proverbial bloody nose when it wasn't expected. But the overall size of the army is quite small, right? But as we move into 1915, it sort of starts growing very quickly. The Indian divisions arrive in 1915. The Canadian division arrives, and it's augmented by the end of 1915 the Canadians arrive, and the Australians and the New Zealanders in 1915 are they've mobilized, they've created their forces, but in 1915, of course, their emphasis is Gallipoli.
Right. The Anzacs are fighting in a terrible place.
Sure. And what we see, though, by the time 1916 rolls around, with the Gallipoli campaign winding down and the evacuation of that, and that's obviously a completely different story. But you see then the Anzac then move into the European theater in the Western Front. So they have a role to play on the Somme as well. Again, speaks to this period of rapid growth in 1915. And it's not just the British Army, it's the Dominion armies, etc., that all have a role to play in this growth. So I guess that sort of speaks to where we end up moving into 1916, is that somehow this new army has been staffed, it has been equipped, it has been trained to a degree, and it is now being sent to France to take its position in the line with the other two essentially British armies, being the regular army and the territorial army.
Is there much left of the British regular army at this point?
So the British regular army, as far as that quality of soldier, in terms of the actual men who were regular soldiers before the war, is essentially gone by the end of 1914 at the Battle of First Ypres. That is a titanic struggle, and it is that last sort of gasp of the British regular army. It's the sort of the old contemptibles, essentially, as a group of people that is cohesive and within their given units ceases to exist. Is that the reservists that were in the regular army before the war and are then recalled and placed in sort of waiting and fed in as replacements and reinforcements for the existing battalions that are in the field, that's all been done. So by the time of the end of the Battle of First Ypres, that is the sort of death knell of the British regular army. The units still exist, but now they are being filled with new recruits and people that have been combed out, reservists, et cetera, that had been in the army many years before in some cases. And now they're existing in the field with this sort of lifeline attached to them. But that mass of regular British soldiers has unfortunately by this point sort of been used up, as it were, which is a sad way to put it. But those battles, especially Ypres, as far as the British are concerned, is hugely costly. And that's just the end of all these battles that have been fought in 1914. So the regular army still exists. The divisions that were formed from it, because most of these divisions never existed before the war. They were put together while these battalions are combed out of the empire, and stations from India and Malta and all these places across the British Empire that would have a garrison battalion in them. What happens often is territorial battalions are sent to replace them. And it's an interesting sidebar about Canada here, is that Canada at the time had one regular regiment of infantry, the Royal Canadian Regiment. And its one battalion were sent to Bermuda to relieve a British battalion that was there. So that British battalion went back to England and was then formed into one of these new regular divisions that were being formed and then sent to France. And that's why the Royal Canadian Regiment is in the 3rd Canadian Division, because they don't actually join the Canadian Expeditionary Force until much later. Anyway, that's a little sidebar, but that's sort of what we're looking at here is these battalions of the regular army being drawn into this and replaced by territorial battalions, Dominion battalions, wherever possible, so that that cream of the army can be where it needs to be. But as we just mentioned, it gets sort of used up by the end of 1914.
Rob, I don't often say, man, I wish I wasn't an American, but once I started studying the Canadians in the Great War, I was like, man, I wish I was Canadian. These are probably the most badass people I've ever read about. So when we cover Canada and the Great War, we're going to definitely have to have you back to provide some more context, because I love the Canadian Expeditionary Force experience, basically from its inceptions all the way to armistice and later. So I'm excited, man.
It's certainly it's a microcosm of that greater experience that we've already been talking about in terms of that building, because the Canadian Expeditionary Force, as I mentioned, Canada had one regular infantry battalion in its entire army. The rest of the militia was all part-time. And in Canada, that building process actually starts in 1914. And the powers that be, Sam Hughes, who was the Minister of Militia and Defense, decides that he's not going to use the existing system that's in place. Right. And he's going to use his whole brand new army. So Canada, if we think of Canada having a regular army of one battalion and a territorial army of the militia, that's in the part-time soldiers that are across the country at the time, Canada creates its own new army in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And that's why the Canadian units that participate and are part of the Canadian Corps, what ultimately becomes the Canadian Corps, are just numbered, because they're numbered battalions of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. They don't necessarily, except for the exception of the Royal Canadian Regiment and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, they don't have names as the regiments that are in Canada have.
Right.
And the 85th Battalion, as you mentioned, and one of your sort of pet sort of avenues of research, one of these battalions that are just raised out of the ether. And it's essentially the equivalent of the new army in Canada, right? Again, the Canadian experience is somewhat of a microcosm, and it has the same warts and bumps and hiccups and stumbling blocks as we see across the British Empire as we try to build in the 14-15 timeframe, try and build armies out of nothing.
Yeah, as you were talking about all this, I was thinking about a lot of the research I'd done where, like, when the guy I'm following, enlists in early 15, he's talking about like the first 5 months that they're at in Halifax, that they don't have uniforms. They're basically in these dog tents. They're training with sticks, and a lot of these like logistical things aren't there for them. And then, he's out of the war in a physical level. Matt and I will say this. He's taken out of the war the day before the battle at Passchendaele Ridge, which I guess is the worst day in Canadian First World War history. And I'm like, well, maybe he's lucky, but he got hit by a shell, so that's not really lucky. But I was reading about what happens to the unit after that, and like they're dealing with the same sort of like more people are enlisting than we can handle. We don't know how to get even later in the war, like how do we get them equipped? What units do we assign them to? So that's why I was excited to have this conversation sort of cover broadly the Somme, because like as I said at the beginning of all this, if you start to get down into the details of this, we could spend like everybody has, we could spend years talking about a month of the war, right? When John was on the show in Q4, we could have talked about just, August of 1914 for the entire 8 hours we had him there. By the way, we're not going to have you for 8 hours. We split that up with John. That was a wild, wild experience. But, it's just, as you were describing these experiences for the British Army, the regular, the territorials, and the new army, I was just like, man, like, I don't know if it was strictly just the British and the Dominion forces, but I imagine everybody getting into this war, that's a microcosm of the entire long century growing up in this great struggle, because, Matt, the Americans are trained by the French basically when we get over there, things like that. So I was just a lot of similar paths of experience, no matter where you look. And that was just pretty wild. Mm-hmm. So we're building a force that England has never seen before. They're usually a small force of guys that can shoot really well, know how to live in the field. When you said that they know how to shoot, I was thinking, Matt, isn't there like a quote of some of the Germans thinking they had machine gun fire withering on them at one point, and it was really just the old contemptibles blasting away?
Yeah, so, the 15 aimed shots in a minute, I believe it's supposed to be, Rob. Germans were.
It's interesting that it is very much a myth, that quote of they thought they were facing machine guns. There's a huge subsect of research and discussion regarding just that phrase, And to date, there has not been, it was supposed to be written down somewhere in somebody's diary or something, but it's never actually been substantiated.
Oh, really?
That's it's the source of all kinds of, especially on the internet, as you might imagine, all kinds of argument. And they said this, and even there are veterans of the Great War that speak to that. But I think that what is important is the aspect of that in particular, and this doesn't really come into factor except in 1914, because we're talking about British regular soldiers here. It's just that it's to date, any serious sort of research into where this comes from comes up with nothing. That it is a little bit of a mixture of urban myth, perhaps some sort of misheard quote, and it's just been compounded over the years, and it becomes this aspect that, there's all bunch of Great War memes, and well, that's one of them. Does it, the spirit of what it says is definitely true, but the fact that it was said and that there was some German going, oh my God, we were faced mass machine guns. Well, there's all kinds of things we can argue about it in terms of it's just not possible. They're just not the case. But what it speaks to is the fact that the army at the time could shoot very well. And that's a whole other subset, something that I deal with quite extensively on the channel, I might add.
Something we deal with similarly here is the history of the devil dog term for the United States Marine Corps. Where did that come from and things like that? I guess that's a common experience in the military. Nobody ever dogs their time. Everybody leaves the field, begrudgingly and to the last, and, with nothing but glory on their faces, and things like that. So of course, the Germans were taking machine gun fire from the old contemptibles, because that's how good those guys were,
Right. And there's no question that they could shoot well, and they could shoot in terms of the standard that they had aimed for was the highest standard of any army in the field at the time. The rifle they had, the way they were trained with it, it's beyond question that was the case. But that specific phrase, there's a number of other things as well that are similar, that are just sort of been compounded in recent history as far as, and have become accepted. And it's very difficult, especially when veterans are talking about that. Is like, well, are they talking about that because other people were talking about that and their friends talked about it, and it's just built upon. But as I say, to date, there hasn't been anything concrete written down saying here's where it comes from, right? So again, very much of a side point. It does, however, if we can take the terms of musketry, musketry being the term used to describe like military shooting,
right?
Not just the shooting at a target, but the application of that fire in the field at given targets, whether they be people or objects or whatnot. That's sort of what musketry means, regardless of the fact that the weapons that are being used aren't muskets. It's one of these terms that gets brought through time and through history to speak to that aspect of military service. What happens is, as we've spoken to earlier about this building phase and the logistical aspect or the lack of logistical support that the Army had in this building phase, is the musketry standards change, and going into the beginning of this building phase, there's actually multiple standards. The regular Army has one, the Territorial Army has one, the new Army has one, and eventually they have to say, hey, look, as time goes on, and this sort of effort, this recruiting effort and the building and maintenance of the Army in the field, we need to have common standards here. And the musketry program does eventually end up there with sort of a universal course of fire, as it were, which is quite comprehensive, actually, and speaks to very closely the pre-war regular standard. The details of the practices change a little bit here and there. That's the standard that's written down. But there are numerous stories and anecdotes of men getting to the front, having shot very little, to the point of perhaps being aware of how their rifle works, but not being professionals at it. This, and it's a way to sort of dovetail the aspect of musketry, as we had a little sidebar, into this Somme experience. And not to say that the men on the Somme couldn't shoot, but they certainly didn't have the resources available to them to spend year after year and going through musketry programs every year when the battalions would go to the range during musketry season, and they didn't have the benefit of that, and the vast majority of them had never held a rifle in their life. So that is an aspect that is perhaps a micro aspect that speaks to the greater macro in this new army construct that's happening, is that, okay, we finally got you rifles and we're going to the range because you need to know how to shoot them. And by the end of it, they've been on the range for a couple of days and everybody shot 15 rounds because they've had 10 firing points and there's 200 guys they got to get through. And, next 10 guys come up and they shoot, and then the next guys, and then the next guys. You can see how this lag in training sort of develops, that if we talk about sort of the colloquial aspect of the new army, is that they are to a degree not as well trained as the pre-war regular army, but in a sense, who could be, right?
I keep laughing because I just have this image of like the pre-war guys missing by a millimeter and somebody screaming at them to be better. And then these Kitchener Tommies, they miss by like 3 inches and they're like, well, good enough. We're at war. Got to get you to the front. We got to get to the next set of guys.
I don't want to belittle the efforts of training staff and whatnot, but you're absolutely right. We know that there has to be examples of that.
Yeah.
That, when you're faced with, 500 men, you've got to push through a range and you've only got 3 days to do it. And, you don't have days and days to develop and practice and mentor people in the aspects of good shooting. You have to get them through. You have to tell them the basics, get them to shoot. And then, they're on to something else because the next guy's got to come through, because the division is deploying in 3 months, and there's a whole bunch of other things we need to do. And this is just one little piece of it because we're building from scratch.
Yeah,
right?
I don't mean to make light of it. I just think that that's just important, is like, that's a real thing. Like the effort, I'm sure, was there, but the reality is there's not enough time to make every single one of these guys experts. You got to train them. What did we say when we were emailing back and forth, right? We know enough to be dangerous, right? These guys had to know enough to be dangerous. They didn't have to be experts, but they had to know, basically point it that way when you pull the trigger. And like,
I don't want to belittle it. I mean, that perhaps has a connotation of just somebody who's sort of holding it funny, right? And just, oh, geez, it went off. I don't know what's going on. I mean, these people had some degree of training and they were held to a standard, right? Because it's a dangerous thing, a rifle.
Absolutely.
And, that piece of it is a sort of basic military tenet. So, but in terms of, shooting at 300 yards and shooting at a moving target at 100 yards, like that kind of thing may have been part of the pre-war regular kind of shooting program. But certainly by the time we get to 1916 or through the building phase here, through 1915, is that there just isn't time. And, if we need ammunition in the millions of rounds to train, but we need the ammunition in the millions on the front, well, where does it need to go? It needs to go to the front because that's where the war is.
Yeah.
So there's when we talk about building the army, the industry is also building, right? And to an incredible degree, they're trying to make more faster with less. Now, manpower is depleted in the factories because a lot of them are off joining the army. There's all kinds of things that happen here leading in towards the Somme that sort of, it takes that long for this to actually become viable, that we can't just take the volunteers and put them into action and fight in late 1915. They're just not ready yet. And that's why when we talked at the very beginning about how the Somme occupies this middle ground of not only the calendar of the war, but also the sort of the evolution and the maturity of the army. It's right in that middle. It's the first time the army is big. It's the first time the army has seemingly, supplies and stockpiles of things they need, ammunition, shells, rifles, all the things that you need to have the army in the field. It's the first time that they've been there in that degree. And from then on, we build on that. But up until this point, it's been building to achieve just where they're at. And that's why the Somme is very interesting in terms of the greater context of the war, in my mind anyway, because you can really see how, it's not a perfect instrument, the army of 1916, nowhere near perfect. And quite frankly, the army doesn't get perfect until 1918. Right. All through the war, there have been phases and battles and activities that have taught lessons, good lessons and bad lessons, and lessons that have been interpreted wrong and lessons that have been interpreted correctly. But at every time they think they have something, I say they as being the establishment of the army, the generals and whatnot, every time they seem to see that, okay, you know what, we found something that works. Let's use this again. Well, we're not fighting automatons. We're not fighting, cardboard targets here that behave the same way every time.
Right.
We're fighting an enemy in the German army. And guess what? When the Germans realized that, oh boy, we took that one on the nose a little bit. What can we do better to prevent that next time? They're doing the exact same thing. So it's not a question of just getting better, because the Germans are getting better, and it's this kind of thing. It's something in sort of, there's a huge body of work being done. I would say that ramped into the centenary of the Great War, and has certainly carried on since, of historians that are sort of re-examining a lot of this stuff, and this process of learning, the learning process. Initially, perhaps it was called the learning curve, but a process, I think, speaks more to what it really was. And it was this sort of incremental change that we get one up on the Germans, we figure something out. Damn it, they figured it out themselves.
Figured it out too.
And now they're too, and now we've got to figure something else out. Or, I mean, as you mentioned, these aspects, we can go down rabbit holes and whatnot. And I understand that that's perhaps not what we want to do here, but it all factors into the what happens at the Somme, right? Because the Somme is this first sort of time where the army has grown to a size that they're like, you know what, we've arrived. We've finally got all these people that volunteered in 1914. We've got them through the process. We've got them in the field. They have the kit they need. And now we're ready to launch sort of our biggest effort to date. And that ends up being at the Somme.
I'm sorry. I was saying it's fascinating to me, Rob, how we're doing this on an army level, as the war is ongoing. But earlier we alluded to the naval race, and from a naval perspective, England and Germany were basically starting the one-upsmanship, in the late 1870s, mid 1880s, because we did in our first season, we covered the White Star Line. And one of the things we rabbit holed in that was a series of naval reviews where the aristocracies of both these countries were basically looking at each other's military and civilian ships and going like, I can make that better and put a gun there. And that started. And I guess because everybody's mind was focused on where, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this on the seas. And then it's, I don't want to say they ignored the fact that Germany was growing a huge army and things like that. But when the war finally is committed and they're like, oh man, we got to have more than just our regular force. It's crazy that there's kind of a 20 to 30 year difference in when they focused on these one-upsmanships, so to speak. Just for some context, because as I was listening to that, I was like, it's weird that, Admiral Tirpitz, remember Matt? Admiral Tirpitz in the 1880s is like, yeah, we need ships, now kind of thing. So anyway.
Sure. And of course, for Britain, their Navy is so important because they're an island and they rely on trade. And they have an empire, which is, for what it is, it depends on that trade, and that trade happens on the seas. Yeah. In order to protect their trade, they need a navy, right? And to protect their overseas possessions and colonies and whatnot, their navy needs to be there. So that's where the British that's where their navy derives its importance from. It's not simply to fight Germany, obviously.
No,
but
right.
The Germans, obviously, as they become, they weren't even a nation until 1871.
I think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
End of the Franco-Prussian War.
They are building, and they want their place in the sun too, as famously the Kaiser, I believe it was the Kaiser, said. So their navy comes about, and there's that naval race coming into the Great War, and of course that comes to its greatest head at the Battle of Jutland, which is also in 1916. Right. Perhaps not a topic for this podcast, but
not today, at least
not today, right? It speaks to that where that line of history ends up. I think we've done quite a bit of digging here and sort of talking about that build and what the Somme and why 1916 is when this ends up happening, is because, quite frankly, it can't happen before then, because it's taken this long to get the new army kitted out, trained to a degree, to an acceptable degree and into the field. But of course, just being in France doesn't make the be all end all as well. They need time in France to get understanding of what the war is all about, which by that point has, been solidified in the trenches that famously extend from the sea to Switzerland. But they need time in the line. They need to get, in dribs and drabs initially, and then eventually units and whole divisions will take their spot in the line facing the Germans. And that needs to happen. You can't just throw people into the meat grinder, as it were. And so, and of course, we don't typically campaign in the wintertime when the weather's poor. We campaign when the weather is good so that we can move, we can see, there's daylight available, all these reasons. And that's as old as history and military, operations forever. So, a big offensive is looked at as being somewhere in the middle of 1916. Something happens in 1915 that it speaks to, again, the Somme, and that is the beginning to understand and the acceptance of the fact that although there are essentially two, although the Belgians have their army in the field, or what's left of it, on the north flank, but essentially the biggest players on the Western Front are the French and the British. And again, at the very beginning, the British are dwarfed by the size of the French army. As 1915 moves along and pressures are undertaken in the French part of the line, that frontage that the British Army, the British Expeditionary Force occupies grows. More divisions come into the field. They're able to take on more of the line. And we see this extend down to essentially the River Somme, which is on the southern part of the British line at the time. So in 1915, this slow process of gradually taking over is paralleled by the fact that there begins to be an understanding through a series of conferences at the highest level that this needs to be a sort of unified effort as best as we can make it, that we're not we shouldn't be operating as two armies in the field doing their own thing, that we need to coordinate, we need to, and I'm talking about using the same kinds of rifles, like that kind of thing, but coordinate our operations because we need to. This is the way forward. This is the way we're going to be able to win the war, because we can't just do our own thing and try our own breakthroughs and all. We need to coordinate. So there's a series of conferences through 1915 and 1916 that speak to this building of this. There's already, there are allies in the field, but the operational ally, the partner in battle, as it were, begins to develop. And it's selected that there will be an offensive, a joint British-French offensive somewhere in the neighborhood of the Somme in 1916. And as time moves on, this becomes more concrete, which is fine. The British Army at this point, it's like, you know what, we can commit to that because we have our new army here. Our production has caught up. We've got stockpiles. I think, yes, that's workable. Let's aim for that. And then, as you mentioned earlier, something else happens because, of course, nobody exists in the bubble.
Right.
There's always external forces at work here. And the Germans decide they're going to do something first. And they drop their proverbial bomb, as it were, at Verdun.
Absolutely.
And which becomes, the single most titanic struggle that the French undertake during the war. I mean that all encompassing, socially, economically, militarily. Like, there's so many aspects to Verdun that I mean, I've been there once, and you walk the ground. It is held in France today as being holy. The ground is holy. The aspects of the battle are holy. And you get that sense when you're there. We were there in April, I think it was. The weather was crap. And that, quite frankly, led appropriate to the experience. That it's almost beyond words when I try and sort of tell you and tell the story, as it were, because when you start reading into it and learning more of the information about it, the numbers involved, this was the focal point of the war for so long for France, and such a huge proportion of the army was fed into Verdun, a battle of survival. The Germans go into that, and they launch their attack, and what this does is it upsets the joint Allied planning that has decided that the Somme is going to be where the Allies are going to strike. And, I think Verdun is launched in March.
It's February. I think it's like February 21st or somewhere at the end of February.
Right. And again, it becomes very much the focal point of everything, as far as the French are concerned. And what this does is it shortens the timelines, but it also takes away from the French aspect of this joint Allied offensive on the Somme, to the point where when it actually happens, it still is a joint offensive, but the French portion of it is greatly diminished.
Rob, am I incorrect in my understanding that when they were initially planning this joint offensive before the German attack, that while it was joint, the French were going to carry the heavier of the two loads, and then this German attack sort of changes that, and then when we get there, it ends up being the British that carry the heavier of the two loads into this battle.
I think that in terms of what we see on the ground, yes, I couldn't talk specifically to the number of units that France was going to commit to it, and number of divisions and whatnot. But by virtue of the fact that there was going to be one effort, Allied effort, combined effort on the Somme, it would stand to reason that if France was going to put all their eggs in one basket for that attack, then their army is so much larger that they would have the assets available to commit a greater, and certainly be the heavier player of the two. But as Verdun progresses, and both sides, the Germans and the French, are ground down repeatedly over such a small piece of ground. It's amazing. I don't mean that in a good sense. It's humbling being there, trying to wrap your head around what went on there. But what this does is it say, we can't commit to the Somme operation to the point where the way we wanted to, because we're fighting for our lives over here.
Yeah,
so
literally
you have to,
our face.
You have to take on more role. Exactly, you have to take on more role and become the sort of the key player here. Now, as they say, in the end, there is a part of the front that is French, and on the southern part. But it seems that there is aspects to the selection of the site, the Somme being the joining of the two armies, the British and the French. And if we're going to go together at something, then that is sort of an obvious choice because our armies dovetail into one another at that point. So let's attack there. So we'll take this side and you'll take that side, and away we go. There's nothing particularly strategic about the Somme. I think there's an aspect going into it that there's going to be a degree of attrition involved in this upcoming battle. Stockpiling manpower, we've built this army up and now we're going to use it. There's always at the operational level sort of contingencies and or hope of breakthroughs and that kind of thing. But the selection of the Somme seems to be focused on that convenient spot at the join of the two armies. That's sort of hindsight now, is one of those things that it happens, and the Somme becomes much greater than that, just simply a point on the map, of course. And the new army, I say that in quotation marks because it's not just the new army. It's not exclusively the new army, but it's predominantly that way, that a number of these divisions are put into the line, and we arrive at the 1st of July, which is the date that is selected, to a degree influenced by what's happening at Verdun. But we need to get going here, say the French. You need to attack, because we're under such pressure here that you need to get involved and start relieving that pressure by attacking the Germans and forcing them to then handle two separate locations on the front, with major actions. And
that's a great point, Rob, and one that I think speaks to some of that social history that you were talking about earlier, because now the Entente, the Allied armies, are coming together as an organized force. Not only do we have the British Empire and the French working together, but the Russians are also stepping up on the Eastern Front to try to relieve pressure on Verdun. The Burislav offensive kicks off in June of 1916 for that exact same reason. The reason we advance the Somme offensive is to help relieve pressure on Verdun. The Burislav offensive on the Eastern Front is doing the same thing. So I think that's an excellent point to make.
Now, I was just saying, Matt,
that you've brought in that all the World War aspect of it.
Right.
The fact that it's not just the Western Front, hugely important, of course, because it is a world war fought on two major East and West, as well as other places around the globe. So, I mean, undeniably, very important point to make.
Matt, for our listeners, is that a coordinated set of attacks, or is that similar to the way the Maryland campaign in the American Civil War as when Lee comes north, it's not just Lee, Bragg is on the move, and they're not directly connected, but there is a overall sort of theoretical coalescence to this? Is that similar to what's going on here with Russia on the move and England getting ready to move?
Actually, no, it's much more coordinated than that. The 1,000-mile front that you were referencing, Pat, is a theoretical coordination between what's happening in the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater during the Civil War. What Rob was speaking to with these coalitions and these meetings that are occurring, particularly through 1915 into early 1916, these are actual coordinating armies and coordinating leaderships saying, okay, things are going to hell in a handbasket at Verdun, and we need to relieve this pressure. Great Britain, we need you to move on the Somme. Russia, we need you to move somewhere. And Burislav, of course, he's going to kick off his offensive that really does beat the hell out of some of the Austro-Hungarians to the point where the Germans need to shift forces to help prop them up, which is kind of a ongoing theme for a lot of the war. But this is a coordinated effort on the Allies' part to have these pieces moving in conjunction with one another to help relieve that pressure on Verdun.
So we're not covering this from the Central Powers perspective, but just try to imagine if you're, the German defenders of these various battles, you're realizing like you have three major actions happening borderline simultaneously all around you. We're talking about the logistical chaos of, bringing up a British army to field readiness and deployment into the field. Imagine the logistical mess it was to just realize that, hey, you're basically being attacked in a gigantic triangle right now. This is why I love the First World War. There's so much that, like, if you get anywhere lower than the 30,000 foot view, you're getting stuck on some small detail for your whole career. That's how I got stuck on the 85th. I wanted to learn about the war, and now I'm wishing I was Canadian because of one unit. It happens. So Verdun is attacked, just for further context, because Matt and I sort of are known for being American Civil War historians. Verdun more or less can be compared to the entire American Civil War in 10 months as far as cost, manpower, and logistical lifts. I think we're talking somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 dead at Verdun in 10 months. That's basically the statistics for the American Civil War after 4 years. So when Rob's talking about like it becomes everything for France, that's sort of an illustration of what that means. Is in less than a calendar year, they experienced the entire violence of our nation's American Civil War, which was a 4-year struggle. So when they're saying the Brits need to get on the move, they mean it, because all hell is breaking loose in Verdun. So how do we get into the actual going over the top on July 1st? There are things I want to talk about with that. Like, I am an artillery geek, and obviously this is one of the big ones and things like that. So is part of this planning, are they from the go, are they approaching it with, we're going to unleash more artillery than the world has ever seen? Is that one of those lessons they've sort of have learned along the way, that these hurricane bombardments to start the ground gaining are key? And I actually have a second question about the ground gaining, but is stuff like the artillery in the initial conception of planning, or is that just sort of like, I guess this is how we'll do it, like closer to the actual July date?
Right. So much like we talked a little bit about this learning process before, and artillery work, obviously being very technical, it certainly is not fly by night. 100% not. That this system has been built by 1916. It is not perfect, but they have taken lessons that have presented themselves over the course of 1914 and 1915. Of course, in 1914, artillery work is very much in the face of the enemy. Bring your guns into action. We can see where they are. Start shooting shells at them, predominantly shrapnel that bursts in the air over top and rains, bullets down on top of exposed troops, whether they be exposed in shallow trenches or moving across open ground. So Neuve-Chapelle in 1915, March 1915, is a case where they feel as though they want to bring to bear a maximum effort in a short period of time as a tactic, as an artillery tactic. So at Neuve-Chapelle, which in the scale of battles fought in the Great War is quite small. I mean, it's very much a sort of a 1914 battle fought in early 1915. A handful essentially of divisions. But what they decide to do is they take almost this huge chunk of the artillery available in the BEF at the time, and they focus it at Neuve-Chapelle. So they make a concerted effort to take other divisions' artillery and bring them into play, because artillery generally, especially at the field battery level, the field guns, in the case of the British, it's the 18-pounder, and divisions also have 4.5-inch howitzers and 60-pounders to the tune of 4 per division, in a regular division anyway. But they concentrate. They say, this is going to be our main effort. We're going to bring in as much extra artillery as we can from other divisions, and we're going to then shoot as fast and as hard as we can onto our objectives and smash the Germans, so that when it comes time that we go over the top, as it were, then they're going to be either all killed, destroyed, or completely dazed, and we'll be able to take the ground. And they do that at Neuve-Chapelle. What happens after that, of course, is counterattacks and being outside of range of guns and all this other thing that part of the learning process, that we've discovered something here at Neuve-Chapelle that worked initially. But the follow-on pieces, if we were thinking about them, we had no way to implement any kind of further plan because we don't have mobility. Again, it is a learning process. Nobody's ever done this before to this degree, especially when we factor in new troops, an army that is, if it's existing regular army units in early 1915, these regular army units have been their manpowers recycled once or twice already. So the people that are there belong to a regular unit perhaps, and may have been reservists or have come from other parts of the empire in terms of regular British soldiers, that is. But you know what? These units aren't the units of 1914. That said, this hurricane bombardment at Neuve-Chapelle is quite successful in the local tactical scenario that the battle sort of develops into. But that is a maximum effort, a maximum rate of fire, as hard, as fast as we can make this. You can't sustain that. And what we see at the Somme is, the artillery is developed and battles are fought throughout 1915, obviously. Loos is an example of an action that's fought, which included the use of gas. Of course, gas comes into play extensively in 1915. The Germans use it for the first time in the war at Second Ypres, of which the Canadians, as a side, take a very important role during that battle. But we can see here, this tactical picture is building, and it's becoming way more complicated. It's not, riding your guns up, bringing them into action in the face of the enemy and firing shells at them, hiding behind our gun shields from machine gun bullets. Now we're talking about the fact that if you do that, you're going to die. Your guns are going to be smashed. Yeah. So now the artillery has taken up very much a method of being in the rear and having observers watch where their shells are landing and sending adjustments back so that the guns can shoot accurately on target. Now, this is by no means the kind of thing that we would expect to happen perhaps today with modern communications, because don't forget, And this is a huge piece of the tactical aspect of the Great War. It is modern in the sense of weaponry, in the sense of logistics and all this kind of thing, but it is antiquated as far as its method of communication goes. There are no radios. There are telephones, there are pigeons, there are runners, and there are messengers on motorcycles, especially in the rear, where they're not going to get blown up. But tactical communications invariably is by runner. So if you, the commander of a battalion, you may have a telephone line to your company commanders spaced at various locations around, which is fine in a defensive kind of situation. But if you're attacking, you can't take the phone with you, right? You can't take it immediately with you. You have to get to a point by which then you can run line up to or back from and establish that network again. But then if you have to move, you've got no way to take the phone with you. So, as I say, communications is a huge piece that needs to be acknowledged and understood as being lacking severely behind other aspects of warfare that have advanced considerably. So by the time of the Somme, they have gone through a number of iterations of different ways to use the artillery. Do we do this sort of hurricane piece and sort of all your eggs in one basket as hard as fast we can, but then you basically, exhausted your gunners? They've been firing so fast for so long that they're physically exhausted. Your stockpiles of ammunition are gone. The ones that are immediately to hand, that is, the tactical supply, as it were. So they decided at the Somme to undertake a very lengthy bombardment, which is as comprehensive as they can make it at that time. And they go undertake a bombardment with the understanding that they're going to try and crush the German defenders and the trench systems. They're going to smash them. They want to try and destroy some of the obstacles that have been put in the way of any attacking force. And predominantly in the Great War, we speak of barbed wire.
Right.
So the aspect of wire cutting is certainly not mature at this point, because they don't have the tools that they need. Famously, I believe it's the 100 fuse is an older pattern of fuse that goes into mass production by increasingly less skilled manufacturers and workmen, or workwomen for that matter. And there comes a huge sort of scandal that happens because not only are numbers of shells not being produced, but the quality of shells comes around as being hugely deficient. And in places like the Somme, there are a huge number of shells that don't simply explode because the shell is deficient. The fuse is deficient. It's not mechanically sound. It wasn't made to the quality that it needs to be made to. There's a huge piece that comes about at the Somme of premature detonation, that the fuse is armed and fires the actual explosive in the shell as the shell is fired. So there's many accidents that occur where the gunners with the 3 or 4 gunners sort of huddled around it servicing this field piece, it blows up and kills the gunners. So again, we talk about the building aspect, is that every aspect of the entire military picture has been brought up by its bootstraps, and it's not perfect at the Somme. There's the materiel is not perfect. As I mentioned, in case I'm pretty sure it's the 100 fuse is not perfect and in fact deficient. The sensitivity of the fuses is not such that it lends itself to blowing up barbed wire, because the fuse will actually not detonate until the shells entered the ground, at which point the explosive power of that fuse the shell is diminished, because all the energy goes into the dirt, not into the air where the wire is. Again, they're just, it was such a Herculean effort just to get the numbers of shells on the ground that we, in that ramp up, that huge ramp up, in getting all this in place, the quality has suffered. Right.
British are also using like lighter shells that are meant more for anti-personnel than for than barbed wire and cutting as well. So in addition to having a ton of rounds that go off as duds, you have a ton of rounds that are ineffective against what they're shooting at too, from what I understand, correct?
So, artillery is a huge, arm. There are different types. There are different roles for each. There's horse artillery that are lighter guns. In the case of the Great War in the British Army, they're 13-pounder guns. The shell is 13 pounds. Then the field artillery that supports the infantry divisions is the 18-pounder. And that's more than likely the field gun that you would see in pictures out there. So it's the most numerous one, the 18-pounder. That's the standard field piece for the British Army. You have the 4.5-inch high, the 4.5 howitzer, which would be the most applicable weapon here for sort of trench warfare, higher trajectory. The shell falls and plunges, but it's also bigger than the 18-pounder. It's got more oomph. It's got high explosive. 18-pounder ammunition is predominantly shrapnel, right, which is intended to explode in the air and then shower down. The utility of, and I can't speak specifically at this point to the exact details of 18-pounder ammunition in terms of high explosive ammunition versus shrapnel and what the ratios were. High explosive ammunition did exist. I can't speak specifically to the details of that right now. But then you've got a whole huge gamut of heavier pieces, 60-pounders, which are the sort of biggest field piece within the infantry divisions, of which there's only 4 in each, a battery of 4 of them. But they're a great big long range piece that actually is developed as a result of the Boer War. But anyway, then you've got a huge gamut of different size howitzers, sort of permanent. There's a number of well-known pictures surrounding the Somme, and it's this massive 6-inch howitzers, 8-inch howitzers, and they're all in these big sort of semi-permanent, I can't really call them carriages, but mounts on turntables implanted on the ground. Like, these things don't move once they're in position. But big squat barrels pointed high in the sky, firing their shells very high and very long ranges, and they're big shells, right? So by the time of the Somme, these weapons have come into play and into service. And for its day, it is unmatched in the number of guns involved at the barrage at the Somme leading into the 1st of July. It is unmatched in terms of volume. It's unmatched in terms of complexity, in terms of scope, what they want to achieve with the artillery plan. It's never been done before to this degree. One aspect that perhaps even casual sort of, I don't call it students, but certainly people who are interested in the Great War, creeping barrage. This term is used frequently in relation to Great War battles. A true creeping barrage has not yet been really solidified in terms of the minutia of the technique yet. And what we see at the Somme are lifting barrages that will fire on a given line and then move, in depth. But the creeping aspect of it, this very incremental advance of the barrage, hasn't quite fully developed by the time of the Somme. And again, as we spoke to earlier, I can't. I want to preface or make sure I caveat that by trying to remember, in the dusty memory banks, things that I've read about that. And I just want to make sure that I'm being as accurate as I can be here. That is my understanding. I'm sure somebody would comment and correct me as far as the minutia of the artillery work on the Somme, but that is what I seem to recall. It is, again, unprecedented in its size. And the duration as well. So gunners are firing day and night in varying degrees of rapidity on various targets, trying in an effort to destroy these German positions simply by the weight of shell fire. That a trench is essentially a big ditch in the ground, dugouts as part of that system notwithstanding, and trying to then just pulverize and turn this ditch into a big flat open, thing that cannot be defended. Hopefully you're going to catch somebody in that trench and kill or wound them. The Germans famously, on the Somme in particular, have a fantastic system of bunkers and shelters built into their trench system. Only the heaviest of guns scoring direct hits with the correct fuse settings so that the shell buries itself deep in the ground are going to sort of achieve any effect with these shelters. And famously, the Germans seek shelter while this bombardment is happening. But it make no question about it that the effect of such a prolonged and quite frankly, very dangerous undertaking as far as the recipients go, plays a huge factor. There's a lot of German anecdotal evidence of the people that were suffering grievously, not from physical wounds, but just from the fact of being under such a long bombardment.
The exhaustion of it.
Well, just going into this bombardment, they see this as like, this is a huge thing. And, almost, do we call it hubris? But almost it's like, how can something this big and so incredibly powerful, how could this fail? This can't fail. It's so big and so powerful that in the end, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the colloquial, World War I kind of, we all we have to do is walk and we'll get there. I don't want to go down that route. There's a lot more. That's another piece of the discussion that requires a lot of nuance and a lot of attention to the details. But it is seen as being this Herculean effort that will, in as much as you can ensure success, it will, because there's not going to be anything left.
It's fascinating when we talk about just, snapshots of the war at different times. And I keep coming back to the fact that I focus on the 1917 sort of spring and stuff like that. But, what you're talking about is like the magnitude of the artillery at this point wasn't just physically devastating, but kind of emotionally devastating to the people that are underneath it. Right. I printed out a whole bunch of the Imperial War Museum's official sort of their stats on this. And they say that between June 24th and July 1st, they fired 1,700,000 shells approximately in like a week's worth of time. And this isn't even the week that the German army calls the week of suffering. That comes in the area that I spend focusing on. That's the week preceding Vimy Ridge and the Arras offensive kicking off. And I'm just sitting here thinking, like, if you have never really experienced this kind of an artillery bombardment, in 1917, like, you must have been living under a rock, because starting in like 1916, like this stat sheet says that in March, they fired almost 2 million shells. In April, almost 2 million shells, almost 2.7 million in May. And like, we're not even to the famous July 1st kickoff date yet. Like this, we're just raining shells, but then and those are over a month, 30-day stretches. They're firing that many shells. They fired almost 2 million shells in a week in the preceding moments of this battle. And it's mind-numbing to me. And also there's like a weird, like, human resiliency that I'm just proud of, that the German defenders on the other side of this were able to survive it. Like, we don't like to do the picking sides, and that's not the conversation we ever have on this show, but there is a human aspect to me that's like, good on you for surviving that, because part of me expects, like, when I first read about that, well, nothing would ever survive that. Like, the Brits were going to fire 2 million shells in 10 days, roughly. Well, of course, everybody on the other side of that's going to be dead. And they're not. And they actually do a ton of damage, when the whistles start to blow on July 1st. So I always like to just put that in context for people that have been following along with sort of my adventure with the Canadians and things like that. Like in 1917, when I finally released a story and we're talking about the week of suffering, like, that's just one of many weeks of suffering that people on both sides of no man's land are going to endure during this war. But here we're talking about one of the first major just onslaughts of raining hell.
It's important to also to realize that the effort made at the Somme, as far as density of guns per mile of the line, and the density of the barrages go, in terms of not only the density, but the number of shells landing per minute, if you will, that it is seen to be this unprecedented effort. But when you compare it to battles in 1917, 1918, it pales in comparison.
Right.
So we speak of that learning process that, at the Somme, this system is still imperfect, and because of a number of issues, both quality, both number, both in terms of the logistics support, also the communication piece. So when we talk about the artillery, it's certainly to date the biggest, best effort. But as you've alluded to, it's not as successful as everybody was expecting, perhaps, is a way to put it. And nothing ever is as successful as you want it to be. But there are some issues that come about, not just on the 1st of July, but as we move through the battle, and as the machine is committed wholesale into the battle, that these things, one day of fuses not firing or the effect that we're trying to get on the ground, it doesn't quite look as though it's happening. But you know what? Tomorrow we got to do the same thing, and in a week's time we still got to do the same thing, and using the same stuff, because those stockpiles, that's what we're using right now. We can't just say, these are no good, use something different. There is nothing different.
Right.
We need to follow the guns, and that's what we're using. And then I look over my shoulder, because that massive pyramid of shells, in the low ground back there, that's what we have to use. There's no option to say, well, go get a new lot, or have them make more at the factory. It's like, this is something that's taken almost a year to get to. That once we're committed to this, it's like, those are the chips we have to play. We got to play them.
I think just for the sake of my brain, they say that somewhere, I think it's estimated that around 30% of the shells that were fired in the week preceding the July 1st going over the top, 30% of those were duds or didn't explode as or planned or whatever. That's over 500,000 shells. I mean, that's like 500,000 attempts that didn't work in their favor. And it's just a mind-numbing statistic. And that's, I guess, for the layman, whenever I get to, what is the First World War? How would you describe the First World War? I say it's a 4-year progress on how to get better at killing. And that's like literally what they do here. And, when we're talking about 17 and 18 having much bigger artillery bombardments and things like that, well, that's because they learned how to do it in 16 and how to do it in 15 and in 14. And it speaks to the learning process and curve you're talking about here. And also I guess you got to kind of up your home front manufacturing. If Matt and I were sort of wondering aloud today if they were aware in real time that these were dud rounds that were being utilized, or if these were, something that they started to learn about maybe towards the end of the campaign or even in the post-war years. Can you speak to when the British started to really understand that they had some manufacturing deficiencies?
Right. So the first sort of real issue comes around as a result in 1914, when the existing stockpiles that are there and the industry that supports that aspect of the military, it all gets used up very quickly. That the shells and everything get sent to France because that's where they're needed, and now the industry just can't make them, and it's called the shell scandal, and it takes if I'm not mistaken, Winston Churchill becomes the Minister of Munitions, and it's his job to sort this schmalzel out, because we have guns in 1915 that are sort of rationed to fire, even in the course of offensive action, like limited numbers, like a dozen rounds a day. That's what the sort of guns are rationed to, because there just simply are no shells, because the industry cannot produce the physical object to the degree that it needs to in terms of the numbers of them. So they get their act together, and through 1915, and the industry piece becomes, I can't speak, is it nationalized? I guess that's one way to describe it, small and nationalized. It becomes under the Ministry of Munitions. There's a whole government ministry dedicated to providing the army its munitions, whether it's shells or bullets or whatever you need. So you ask, are they realizing this stuff is happening? There's various aspects in this particular artillery ammunition that are becoming apparent, that are being addressed. But in the rush to get this production up, the quality starts suffering. And the aspects, I'm pretty sure I've got it, one of my references here, that it's the number 100 fuse. And for those that perhaps don't understand what a shell fuse is, we're talking like clockwork inside it, that it'll get set off, if it's timed, there's an actual timer in it that, based on the time of flight of the shell from the gun to the ground where it lands, they set that fuse to explode. There's other fuses that are intended to explode when they hit the ground, and they're very sensitive. So there's pieces inside that, mechanical pieces inside that fuse, that will move when the shell hits the ground, the instant it hits the ground, and then detonate the body of the shell. So, we're not talking something that you can sort of crank out in your garage. with a welder and some sand casting or something. This is something that needs to be machined to extremely high tolerances by people who understand what it is they're doing and understand the nuances of what they're doing. So again, we come back to this building phase, right? Is that we need more shells, we need more faster. It's like, I just need more shells, just get them, instead of making 4 an hour, you need to make 8 an hour. Okay, but you're rushing me, man. And I don't know if my tolerance is, I make more shells. Okay, I'm making more shells. And what happens is the result of which are deficiencies in quality. Now, these deficiencies do, and design as well, not just the quality, but actually the mechanics of the designer, in some cases deficient. These are identified throughout the course of, not perhaps in real time, like you suggested, but perhaps, over a course of months or the first few weeks of a battle. It's like, Jesus, there's a lot of duds. I'm watching my fireland and every so often I'm seeing duds that there's no explosion, but the next round I fire, I see the explosion as I'm looking through my binoculars, over my sandbag or whatever, or from my paper mache tree that I erected at nighttime in no man's land.
I love those. I love nothing to see here. Me just as a tree.
So, there are deficiencies throughout the war that are made note of and are remedied through a better design, through better quality control, a number of aspects. So that would speak to the question that you just asked. Yes, it goes from the 100. Just bear with me here. I've just got a book here. The 100 fuse, and it's replaced by like the 107 or something like that.
I got to ask a nerdy question just because, I got to do that from time to time. I am a self-professed artillery geek, and I have the good fortune and privilege of being able to run the 10-pound Parrott rifle at Manassas National Battlefield for their volunteer program. And one of the things we talk about is, percussion cap rounds and timed fuses and things like that. And those are obviously cut to burn at certain time increments. So is there more of I'm going to use quote digital, but not in the way modern digital, but is there more of a mechanical timer situation happening in these rounds, or is it still like a cut and burn, 3 seconds, 5 seconds kind of thing?
No, they're mechanical, so that they're set. When the round is fired, there's some sort of inertia device inside the fuse that will set that timer off. And then when the timer is expired, that something will be released, and probably a spring and a striker hits a primer, which then fires a charge, which then explodes the shell.
There you go.
In the case of a time fuse. Then there's other fuses that rely on typically some sort of inertia device when it hits, and very, very, very sensitive, that when the nose of the shell hits the ground, then it instantly detonates. But as I say, as he was talking about earlier, some of these aspects about the intended design are deficient and they don't function necessarily as intended. I'm just looking, it was the 106 fuse that comes in later that essentially solves the quality issues with the 100 fuse and the whole going off prematurely, but as well as the sensitivity piece that allows the shell to explode above ground as literally the nose of that shell hits, boom, which then has the blast it's not contained by the ground as in the shell's buried. It happens outside, and it's these types of devices that enable truly effective wire cutting to happen. And it's literally this process by which shells are fired into a barbed wire entanglement, and it's literally blown up so that there's little pieces like this left instead of big coils. And that way the infantry can then navigate that and get through it and past it. So the artillery is a hugely technical aspect, both in the gun itself, the ammunition, but also its direction and its control, its organization. Because when we talk about these barrages, we have batteries of 6 guns set up, usually in general localities. Let's take a field battery of 6 guns. So there's 6 guns and there's 3 ammunition limbers per. Typically in a static location, you'd have dug in supplies of literally like shells on the ground under a tarp, ready to go. And the 6 guns would have specific direction and elevation to fire at, so that their shells land in a given location. And then the sophistication is such that other batteries firing from different locations will fire, and their shells will land next to, and sort of making a line of impacts. And this has to be orchestrated because obviously the ground is not a grid.
Right.
The ground is It's the earth, so things move and things. I'd say move, but the ground undulates, and there's the trench lines are all wobbly. So we need to coordinate this and range the guns so that they know exactly what elevation to fire at, so their shell will land exactly where you want it. So you can see this process to develop this barrage in terms of this battery will shoot here in this section of trench and this kind of thing, hugely complicated. And to date, it's the biggest, most comprehensive effort that the Royal Artillery, I say that colloquially as being the artillery arm of the BEF, has undertaken, right? So as you might imagine, there's a lot of things riding on it, and a lot of I would say hope. Hope is a bad word to use. Understanding that this will have the effect that we want it to have. For sure.
Yeah, I feel like hope, with the way that the British and a lot of the reading I was doing leading up to this, the way I sort of was interpreting this in my mind is hope leaves a lot to chance, and the British felt that this wasn't chance, that this was gonna just work. Like they just,
right.
I felt like they felt like this, like you said, maybe hubris, but like this can't fail. We're going to do this on such a grand scale that that's where they, I don't know if it was ill-intended or not, but that's where the walkover, somebody said, you're not even going to need your rifle. You just need walking sticks, when you go over the top and things like that.
Was that said by somebody somewhere? Sure. Maybe it was a commander, a local commander trying to, let his troops know that you have the best support behind you, and they're doing the work that is going to, make your job easier crossing no man's land. Sure. Was that kind of thing said? Sure. Was that the overall arching kind of,
no,
communication and messaging across the BEF about how this is going to work? No, it's not. But I mean, it is such a huge effort that they're doing their best. They're putting their best foot forward because this is what they think is going to work, based on their previous experience. Again, it's a learning process. They take aspects of things that were tried before. How deep do we fire this barrage? Do we fire it as, do we concentrate on the front trench? Do we concentrate on the first two trenches? Do we do each one in sequence? What else is out there we need to shoot at? Is it just trenches? What about the other artillery? What about the German artillery, right? All these things come into play. So, it's a battle within a battle, the artillery piece, and the amount of manpower, attention, and detail that needs to go in it is unbelievable. But famously, it is an enormous barrage, and that lasts for days and days and days. And the understanding is that it will smash, or will have smashed, whatever obstacle is going to be in your way. Of course, that, as we know in hindsight, doesn't happen the way it was intended to. It happens in spots, but not in that overall effect by any stretch.
Well, then let's get into that, right? So, I talked about, over the course of months, almost 2 million shells in March, almost 2 million in April, things like that. Let's just, in the week leading, I said they fire more than 1.5 million shells. The Imperial War Museum puts it at a clean 1.7 million shells, but you're not going to have your guys go over the top into that. We're not using creeping barrages yet, the way we understand a creeping barrage, where essentially the rounds are landing as in front of the infantry within yards as they're moving. Maybe we're using more of the lifting barrage where they fire, then there's maybe a momentary, when I say moment, I could mean maybe a minute or 5 at a time where there is an artillery, but then it starts to land a little further ahead. So it's not like this consistent thing, but at a certain point, the artillery lays off and the whistles blow, and it's July 1st, it's 7:30 in the morning, and the guys go over the top in what becomes the worst day in British military history. Can you just tell us a little bit about, what in general terms, like what is the plan? Is this, is the Fourth Army and General Rawlinson, are they after ground, or are they after just inflicting damage at this point? Because remember, they're looking to relieve the Germans, but they're also everybody's still looking for the big breakthrough. Like this is something that no command has given up hope on yet. These are guys from the old era. Haig, I think, is a cavalry guy who still has, we'll get into that another time, but Haig's still thinking about sending his Elan, to break through and carry them all the way to Berlin and things like that. So is this more about gaining ground, or is this more about just smashing the Germans in the face right now?
Well, in terms of getting that ground, you have to smash the enemy in the face. So,
good point.
To say that they come together, sure. The Germans have 3 lines, if my memory serves me correct, the third line is somewhat incomplete, but becomes complete very quickly once the attack is understood to be having on the Somme. And each of those lines consists of multiple trench lines, one behind the other. So, it is a system on the Somme that the British are facing. And, the objectives that are laid on for the first day go very deep into the German defenses, very deep. And the overall understanding is that they're going to, leapfrog through and take these various lines of trenches to get to the point where they get some sort of breakthrough. There is obviously, in the tactical aspect of the Somme, there is an understanding that a breakthrough is something that we're aiming for. There are forces in place, particularly cavalry, that are there, ready and do get used to some degree during the battle. So if they weren't anticipating trying, to break through, then those kinds of forces would not be there. I think there's an understanding by this point of the attritional piece to fighting on the Western Front, without having specific references at hand and quotes from generals and this kind of thing. I guess we could talk about what the intent was all we want. What ends up happening is something that is very much attritional, especially even in the context of the Greater War. The Somme becomes an attritional battle, much like Verdun. And Verdun famously is undertaken to bleed the French army white. Well, if that doesn't speak to attritional warfare, I don't know what does. So it's important also to put that aspect in the greater context of the war, is that this isn't just something about, bumbling generals throwing manpower into machine guns. This is a nature of warfare at that particular time in history. This is the way war gets fought.
You mean we're not talking about lions and donkeys right now? We're not doing that. I said we're not doing that, but I am a big fan of shredding that crap to bits. So
there's certainly overwhelming and how do you say, research and attention that is divorced from the emotion put towards trying to put that where it belongs.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Somewhere
There's
else.
a huge number of historians and authors and learned people who are trying to sift through you might be familiar with the Western Front Association.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And certainly if you're not, then you need to be.
Yes.
Because it's the work that they do both in bringing academics into play and also the presentation of information, both in social media, YouTube and Facebook and that kind of stuff. It really, we're talking like world-renowned academics here in terms of authors, people who have done incredible amounts of research. They have picked apart, if for lack of a better term, some of these aspects that what we think we know about the Great War. I say that we in the greater context of society. When you say Great War, undoubtedly the first thing that comes to mind is Blackadder, right? So I don't mean you. I just mean in general. Right? They made a video specifically on that subject, and the thumbnail that goes with the video is of Blackadder, and it's what you think you know about it, and is that actually correct? And as this body of research matures and is developed, it's very clear that that's not the case. That this is simply a function of the way warfare happens, because nobody's ever done this before. There is a learning process. Mistakes are made. Mistakes are overcome, and then they're also countered when those new things come in to try and surmount the obstacle. But now there's a new obstacle in place, and it may have worked 2 months ago, but now it doesn't, because they've changed. Now we have to change, and you know what? Now we have more success or no success. It's just it's an uphill battle. I get it as far as the historians go, but as a side point, like you spoke about the whole lions and donkeys thing, like it's certainly not. And I would agree with you there, is that it needs to be put in its proper spot, which is, quite frankly, not in any seriousness as it relates to the Great War.
I think that's also important
Rob?
go ahead, Matt. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking on context, do you think it's easier from a researcher and historian perspective, or is getting easier, perhaps I should say, to have these more nuanced and thought-provoking discussions because that generation is sadly no longer with us, and the emotional attachment to the cost of the war is not quite as pointed as it once was?
I think that, and by no means I have not spent huge amounts of time trying to get to the bottom of why this exists, this general understand, or I say understanding, right, with in quotation marks, of what the Great War was all about. But I think that there's, well, how many people showed up to Haig's funeral?
A lot.
Good point.
It was, if I say 1 million, it's probably not 1 million, but then it was like 750,000, or
Right,
it was
a
one and a
lot.
half. It was an incredible showing of people at this whole, I say funeral, it wasn't obviously the procession stuff. So if he was such a bad person in the context of the war and sacrificed a generation on his shoulders, on his ego or whatever, like if that was the way people thought of him, there wouldn't have been that many people at his funeral. There's only so many people that want to show at the funeral to, hurl insults or whatnot, right? But it's just, so did this attitude exist in the immediate post-war? Perhaps not. Did the veterans of the war, as time progressed and the 20s and 30s marched on, the Depression hits, did they see a result in their favor that they might have expected given their sacrifice and their effort during the war? No, they didn't, right? So is there some sort of disaffection that begins to happen? Okay, sure, I can understand that. And then, of course, the Second World War happens, and sort of that becomes the social focal point in terms of the touchstone, as it were. And then, the post-war world into the 1960s, and a different attitude sort of takes place across the world, the Western world anyway. And there might be, at that particular time, a intensification of the uselessness piece to the story, to the narrative, to sort of put it in that sense. And that comes into the late 20th century and governs the way it's thought of through that whole period of time, because just society changes, the way they think about things change. But the reality of what happened and the way it happened gets clouded with the sassoons and the poetry and which quite frankly are taken to be the sort of the voice of a generation. But an interesting point that was made to me when I was in just south east west of Vimy. It is Maison Blanche, which is a location outside of Arras, caves, subterranean tunnels and caves and whatnot, where predominantly British and Canadian soldiers, although Germans sheltered there as well, and I believe some French. But Arras is riddled with caves, that whole area, and subterranean caverns and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, this one place in particular has proven to be a gold mine for graffiti. And there's a group called the Durand Group, which you may be familiar with, that specializes in Great War, in particular Western Front archaeology, and supervise the vast majority of subterranean exploration and or rediscovery. A huge sort of marquee group of people, professionals, academics, volunteers. They are the people that manage that aspect of it. And one of the people there during the visit that I undertook there, I mean, it's unbelievable to be in the cave and look at everything that's in there, because it's just covered in carvings in the chalk, unit cap badges, names, poem, like you name it. It's just incredible. And some of the much like police in the modern era will be able to pick out authors of graffiti written on the side of a subway car or something. These guys can pick out, oh, that's so-and-so. That's the guy who carves like that. And that's his work over there. And this guy carved stuff everywhere. But a point was made to me by one of the individuals in the Durand group. He said, I'm just going to pick numbers out of here. We've discovered 2,000 pieces of individual graffiti in the caves and bunkers and dugouts. We've discovered 2,000. 1,000 of them or 1,500 of them are at Maison Blanche. That's how prolific the carving goes in this location. So when I expressed to you the sort of the awe that you have going in here, it's founded. He says, do you know how many of all those graffiti pieces indicate anything negative towards the war effort, towards the army, towards the leadership, towards my fellow soldier beside me? How many of those? I flash your attention to the side of an American GI's helmet in Vietnam that's got a peace sign and says, "Get me the hell out of here," or whatever. Probably stronger language than that. Like, that's what we're thinking of when we think graffiti. Do you know how many pieces of Great War graffiti they found out of 2,500 or whatever it is across the Western Front?
I want to be bold and say zero.
Any kind of negativity?
I want to say zero.
Right? So
that's amazing.
If the soldiery felt so poorly about what they were doing and about their leaders, would you not carve like Haig is a dick?
Yeah.
or get me out of here, or these butches are going to kill us all, or whatever, right? The language of the day. It was something that he told me that it was kind of, it made you stop, and you're like, you're right, there would be something. Now, society was different back then. There was much more hierarchical piece to it, and do as you're told. Society was like that, right from school-aged children. Like, everything about society had some degree of hierarchy to it. So, would you get the outbursts that you might expect in a social exchange today? Perhaps not. But in some deep cave somewhere where you're shacked up on bunks 3 high, the water's dripping off the ceiling, no one's down there except for you and your buddies. And you roll over against the wet chalk wall and you're right, I hate it here, or whatever. Like, sure, if that's the way you really felt, I'm not saying they didn't hate it there, but they didn't see fit to write it on the wall. They carved cap badges and wrote their unit name and their dates that they were there and all kinds of other things.
That's important.
But not one piece of negative.
I was saying
we're way down the rabbit hole here.
But that's important, because one of the things that Matt and I were discussing because I'm like your typical Irish guy. I use humor in awkward situations pretty regularly. And one of the things, when you talk about the Somme is you talk about a ton of really awkward things. You talk about a lot of violence, a lot of death. You get the real beginnings of the lions led by, or not the beginnings, but you get the real meat of the lions led by donkeys thing. And I am a huge fan of crushing, just historical falsehoods, or I don't want to say mythology, because there's some positive mythologies, like, the old Contemptibles could fire a machine gun rate, things like that. But, here, I like to crush the lost cause of the American Civil War. Huge fan of doing that. With the Great War, I feel like the lions led by donkeys thing is one of the things I like to crush, because one of the questions I would always ask is, well, what would you do in that situation? And inevitably, it immediately derails the entire conversation, because how could you put yourselves into the shoes of a command that has never seen a war like this? On all sides of no man's land here. In the American Civil War, we have guys at the beginning who are in command of much larger forces than they've ever commanded in the fields. And that is its own learning curve and things like that. And here we have guys like Haig and who's the French guy I'm thinking of? Joffre, who they've come from these older eras where, the cavalry on horseback, Dan Carlin does a good job illustrating this with you want to know what Napoleon's cuirassiers look like? Look at them in 1914. There's a whole lot of old era, when they say it's the long century, the 19th century,
that's
stumbles.
Exactly what I was going to say, Pat. That goes back to our conversation on the long century. And this is the end of the 19th century. It just happens to be in 1914 that it begins to end.
But I'm 35 and change is hard for me. I'm in my mid 30s and I don't like to change some of the things I've been doing, for 5 years, much less 10, much less 20 years. And you could imagine, what sort of personality type it takes to become in the upper echelons of leadership of all of these armies in the field, and what it took you to learn and persevere through to get there. Are you really trying to feel like a novice. Again, I don't want to speculate that Haig felt like a novice. I'm speaking super generally right now, but guys are relying in the most trying time. You rely on your training. That's the purpose of training. You rely on what you know, and what these guys know is outdated. And some of them are aware of it. Some of them are not. I don't feel like these were, and I think that's where the conversation of malicious intent, I feel like lions led by donkeys means that like somewhere Haig sat in a dark room with a candle and was like, yes, we're going to send them over the top to get slaughtered. And like, those are not the things that are occurring here. They're trying to fight a war in the best way they know how at the time with the best informations. And like you said, mistakes are made, positive and negative lessons alike are learned here. And that's just sort of one of the things I like to get into right as the bullets start to fly on July 1st, because what we're going to talk about at times is going to defy that logic. It's going to seem like, well, they should have known better, but everybody should remember as we talk about this, we have a century under our belts of hindsight at this point. And we have the luxury of being able to study this on pages of books and in television documentaries and things like that. And nobody lived through it or is getting shot at. So just something to consider, that this is something that I want to disperse as much as we can, because I challenge you, the listener. What would you do if you possessed the knowledge that these guys possess? What would you do differently? And again, if you want to let us know, historythingspodcast@gmail.com. That's great. I'm not really asking for your feedback, but if you want to give it, go ahead. But like, it's just one of those rhetorical, like, put yourself in their position. I think you would immediately knock off that, Monday morning quarterback crap. It's something I'm guilty of having done, and I feel sheepish, but I'll admit it. And it's something I try not to, the better I become as a historian and researcher, is like not so much judge the decisions these guys are making, because I don't know if I could make any of these decisions knowing I'm sending thousands of men into the grinder, millions of men over the course of a war, things like that, how many lives you're changing and all that. So I think that's important context as we literally are blowing the whistles at 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, is there's so much more than your 30,000 foot view you're getting here is going to give you, and that even these guys had on the ground level at the time. So I'll get off my soapbox. We'll go back into the trenches because we're trying to get out of the trenches now. The green fields of France, as sung by Dropkick Murphys, is one of my favorite First World War songs of reference. But it's something that I like to paint visually as well. When we think of the First World War, I always tell people, if you close your eyes and imagine the First World War out there, you're probably imagining Passchendaele, 1917. You're probably imagining endless seas of mud and shell holes and things like that. And sure, that exists in 14 and in 15 and in 16, but you're really imagining the stuff in 1917. For a moment here on large sections of the Somme, there's these nice green fields that these guys are about to go up and over. So, not to say they had the arrogance or the hubris or whatever that, the artillery barrage, took care of everything in front of them. But when they go over the top, do you think the general rank and file, in combination with their expectations of the artillery and the serene landscape in front of them, you think they're aware of what, or even remotely close to expecting what they're walking into as far as, German machine gun fire and things like that? Or do they think that they're about to have this sort of walkover experience?
I think that these divisions will have been in the line for quite some time by this point. They're not, it's not like they came out straight from England, crossed the channel and came to France, got on a train, got off the train, marched and got into their trench. And then the next day they attacked. So these divisions have been in the line for a while. They understand the generalities of trench warfare of the era. And obviously at some point they're made aware that there's going to be an attack and they're getting ready for it. The German commander locally is understanding that something's going to happen here in the next little while, in terms of being months in advance. Something is happening in the spring or summer. We need to expect an attack here because I can see things are happening. There's information from reconnaissance that it's happening, indicating, stockpiling, activity, you name it, extra digging, all that kind of thing. I'm glad you mentioned the point about the grass because I sat at the Sunken Lane, which is just north of or just outside of Beaumont Hamel. And the day that we were there, very pleasant. I'm from Canada and we use Celsius, but it was something like 20 degrees or maybe 17 degrees. Very pleasant. I don't know what that means in Fahrenheit. What is that, like 70 degrees? Something like that. You're looking it up, or you're making the conversion.
We're Americans down here. We don't know about metric systems. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let's see. Google says 68 degrees. So a nice Christmas day here in the mid-Atlantic. Ugh.
Okay, is that Christmas? Okay.
I mean, literally, it was like 60 degrees. I mean, it was 60 degrees yesterday. So here's how weird our weather is. I imagine you guys get normal winters, and I don't know what summers are like, but I imagine, does it snow pretty regularly in the winter up where you are?
Canada?
Yeah.
In general, yes.
Yeah, so cool. So it was 60 degrees, 65 degrees yesterday, and then a snowstorm that dropped almost a foot in some parts hit today.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Hashtag Maryland. Let's go. But no, the green fields are something I like to focus on too, because it's not an image you really associate with the First World War.
Because it's summertime and it's nice weather, and the rains haven't come yet. So the endless fields of mud, like you allude to, that people have this mindset of this image in their mind of Passchendaele. Even Passchendaele started with good weather and good ground, but it eventually became what it became. And that stereotype of Passchendaele fighting comes as a result of the realities later in the battle. And in the Somme as well, because the Somme drags on to November,
yeah.
And the weather turns. So, but in July, it's beautiful. The birds are singing and carrying on as best they can under this barrage. The ground is good. It's not, impassable, shell-marked, morass. Undoubtedly, people will just deviate to that kind of image in their mind the instant the Great War is mentioned. But this is a perfect example of that is not the case. It's a very pleasant, beautiful day, apart from the fact that there's a war on right there. So to speak to your question, do these guys know what they're getting into? I think they understand the danger of being at the front. They would have been under machine gun fire, sporadic. They would have undertaken, work parties in no man's land at extreme peril, putting up barbed wire and this kind of thing, because as much as the attack is going to be mounted, they still have to defend themselves and defend their positions and dig trenches and dig dugouts and all those kinds of things that may be destroyed by German shell fire. They've been under German shell fire. So, to say that they're just, lambs to the slaughter, I don't subscribe to that. I think that might come from the fact that they are the new army. They haven't been out since 1914. That may be where that comes from, and maybe figuratively. But as we talked about earlier, even those old formations, the old battalions, they've been crunched through, their manpower is turned over, again and again. So even they're, relatively speaking, new. The unit may not be new, but the manpower in it, to a degree, is as new as any other. So they've been sitting in there jumping off trenches or shortly, or a short distance behind, in their trenches, in their trench system that parallels the Germans the whole way, and they've been listening and seeing this barrage go over, maybe taking a peek through a pair of binoculars or through a vision slit somewhere, as being a sentry and witnessing what's going on. Have they ever seen such a thing before? I would say that because there is not really anything comparable in that frame of time where the new army takes to the field and the Somme, that they probably haven't seen it. Well, quite frankly, we've already spoken to it. Nobody's seen this before,
right?
In terms of its magnitude and the sort of power that it's projecting, that it just goes on all day long. You just hear the guns, you hear the shells bursting, you can see the explosions. They're just happening all day long. How could anything live through that? So I would understand that there would probably be some degree of expectation. Perhaps not that you'll just have to walk there. As we talked about earlier, was that said by somebody somewhere and maybe believed by a lot of people even? Sure. But was that the sort of the ethos that the army went over the top with? I think that there was enough people around that would understand that regardless of what happens, as we've seen the rest of the time in this war, that whatever thing we put in place, nothing is perfect. So, we are going to have to fight for this.
What's that old adage? I think it lasts in all wars, that your plan basically ceases to exist upon first contact with the enemy.
It's one of Murphy's military laws or something.
Yeah, something like that. Right. So, all right. So no more interrupting for me. So let's get our guys over the top. Let's get the BEF out of the field. So we have, roughly 60 to 70,000 men going into action, along an 18-mile front. This isn't condensed to one or two towns or one small wooded section. I mean, this is a massive section of frontage that they're on the move against. So what happens? The whistles blow, the men start going over the top, and it's just a nice walk, right? That's what we've said this entire time.
Right. So there's a bit of a rude awakening, obviously. And you know what? It's important to also understand that there are successes on the first day of the Somme. The first day of the Somme is, as taken as a whole, is deemed not successful and a bit of a disaster. But as far as local advances and local attacks go, there is and are successes, mostly in the south, mostly in the north of that section of front that we're talking about. The cataclysmic failures sort of come home to roost. One of these stereotypes that it's often alluded to is the fact that they were told to walk across no man's land. You will only walk. And I think that maybe if we just get into that a little bit, there's a few things that play into that. One is what they're carrying.
Yep.
That is an aspect that I think we need to talk about. So the British soldier of 1916 compared to the British soldier of 1914 is emburdened, specifically at the Somme as well, emburdened with a huge load, more so than he carried in 1914. Starts with this.
Yeah.
This comes into play in very late 1915, but by the Somme is on issue to every man. A shrapnel helmet is something that initially starts as being trench storage. It's like when your unit comes in, the unit that was there that you're taking over from, they give you their helmets because they're used for the trench. And when you leave, you don't have a helmet, you have a soft cap on. At the intent, that was never the intent of the thing, but that's as things are produced. We talk about the build up and the building phase again. As these things become available, that's how they get used first. But by the Somme, everyone's got one. And the German army as well has done something similar with a different style of helmet. The clothing they're wearing, it's obviously the summertime. So they're wearing their normal service dress made of wool, a tunic, trousers, puttees up to the knees, and a pair of leather boots. So in that sense, there's not much different from the beginning to the midpoint of the war. But it's when you start talking about what the things that they're carrying, that changes. The regular infantryman, I say regular, I mean the normal infantryman, not regular army infantryman necessarily. Apart from a steel helmet, he's got his rifle, which for the British Army is that the short magazine, the Enfield.
Yep,
I got one of those,
and up to 250 rounds. So the understanding is that this is going to be a big attack. We're going to reach our objectives, but then we're going to have to stop and maybe fight off a counterattack because the Germans, we know, always counterattack. Part of that is making sure that we have enough ammunition in order to do that. So not only the equipment carries 150 rounds, but we're going to give everybody a couple of extra bandoliers, which hold 50 rounds each, and those get slung over the shoulder. On top of that, when we get to where we're going to go, we're going to have to either dig something or improve the hole that we find ourselves in, the hole being the trench or the whatever, the position. How do we do that? Well, everybody carries a little tiny little mattock. It's about the size of a teak, like a side plate in terms of digging blade, not very big at all, which is made for sort of emergencies and that kind of thing. But it's an entrenching tool. We're not going to use those because they really can't get us underground to the degree that we need to. So we're going to have to carry a shovel, which is like a full, proper, like 4-foot long shovel with a blade on it that can move earth, or a pick. So someone's got to carry those. We've got to get those forward, right? On top of that, as we talked about in 1915, gas is an issue. And in 1916, gas is mitigated by a series of what are known as hoods. And what we might think of being a gas mask today hasn't been invented yet. If it's been invented by 1916, it certainly is not in service yet. And anti-gas equipment, generally speaking, is afforded the individual by pH hoods. And what that is essentially a fabric bag sewn like this. And by the time of the Somme, generally they have two glass eyepieces and a tube with a rubber valve on it that it allows for exhalation, so you can blow out of it. But when you suck, you can't suck air through it because the rubber collapses and it won't let air in. So it's only one way. So that's for exhaling. The breathing in happens by actually air passing through the bag that's on your head, of which there's a number of layers. So this is your anti-gas protection. And everybody carries two of these hoods in a little pouch that's about, just under a foot wide, like maybe 10 inches wide by sort of 8 inches tall.
That sounds incredibly claustrophobic, Rob. Like just listening to that, it's giving me anxiety.
Imagine taking a wool blanket and cutting out a big piece and putting it over your head and then stuffing it into the collar of your shirt.
No thanks. Hard pass.
Right. So everybody's carrying, and these are soaked. It's not just the fabric. These are soaked in chemicals. So they're wet. And in those little bags is like an oilskin or a rubber inner bag that keeps the hood wet. So when it comes time to use it, you're putting this sort of damp, soaked cloth bag over your head and tucking it into the collar of your tunic. And then you clamp your mouth on this exhalation valve. And when you breathe in, you're just sucking this air through the bag and looking through these eyepieces that are all wobbly. And
I'd like to actually amend what I just said, because now considering that these things are, my choices are breathe the gas or breathe this way, I'll put the bag on every time. Every time.
So again, they only last for a certain amount of time, but everybody carries two. And individually, they don't weigh much. However, it's a cumulative effect. We might have to fortify the position we get to. So what does that mean? Well, we might have to fill some sandbags and stuff. So everyone's going to carry some sandbags. Also, you're going to need to carry some food with you because you might be at this for a day or 2 days. So here's rations, which are all in tins of bully beef and hardtack. We also have things like wire cutters and other tools that we think we're going to need in order to cross perhaps no man's land, navigate obstacles, especially those that we anticipate coming to further into the position. And what you end up happening is the soldier is burdened like a Christmas tree with all these things hanging off him, and the weight, especially of ammunition, becomes great. Now, we've come a long way in talking through what you're carrying, because this speaks to how fast you're going to move. And you're not a jackrabbit when you're wearing and carrying everything, right? On top of this, you've got Mills bombs, hand grenades. If you're a rifle bomber, you've got them specifically fitted so that you can fire them out of your rifle. So again, the weight is greatly increased over the weight that the infantrymen carried in 1914. So again, we're coming back to this. Did we just get up and walk? That did happen. But I want famously, we should be, I would expect, somewhat familiar with some of those iconic images from the Somme, as was filmed by Jeffrey Malins, the famous photographer who brought his movie camera to the Somme and photographed a lot of the activities on the first day. The explosion of the mine at Beaumont Hamel, or just outside of it, Hawthorne Ridge, I'm sorry. There's only one film of a mine going off on the front, and that is filmed by him, and it's used in every war documentary, everything you've ever come across.
Ever.
So that series of pictures was filmed just outside of Beaumont Hamel, and he filmed the mine going off, and then he turned his camera and filmed advancing troops, which in that locality, if I'm not mistaken, they advanced a bit late through some reason, but he's filming them. And as you see them advance, they're running and they're spaced out. but they're moving quickly to try and capture the ground that they have understood to be there for the taking after the mine's gone off. Now, if we get down that rabbit hole, it doesn't work out that way.
Sure.
Through a number of reasons: bad coordination, timings are missed, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that is used to describe the fact that they were running, they know it's dangerous. And the best way we can protect ourselves is to get where we need to go as fast as we can. So this image of people lining up quietly in the trench and then climbing up and then like lining and the whistle goes and we all start walking forward. I'm not going to say that didn't happen, but it is not that kind of omnipresent tactic that there is, and tactics that are used. Famously, I want to say, was it the 36th, the Ulster Division at the Schwaben Redoubt, which is just north of Tiepville. I might be getting my units mixed up, but they famously crawled out into no man's land. They pushed them as far out as they could possibly go under the barrage, so that when 0 hour hit, they were up and in and completely successful.
See, I don't know stories like that. That's good to know.
So here's an example of a local tactic based on surprise and timing. That instant the barrage lifts we're at, and we have halved or quartered the distance it's going to take us to get to the German trench. And locally, it's successful. It suffers later from counterattacks and whatnot. So there are examples of local tactical decisions that are made that sort of produce decent results. Far and away, there are countless stories, though, of things going awry. The reputation of the Somme, particularly the first day, doesn't come into play because it's fabricated out of nothing. There is obviously some historical context and background to why it has the reputation it does. An example at Beaumont Hamel, which is just south of Hawthorne Ridge. The town is east of or northeast of Hawthorne Ridge, but in the modern day, a park exists called Newfoundland Park, if I'm not mistaken, and it is there as a preserved section of the trench lines from predominantly the first day of the Somme. There's also trench lines that come through from 1918 there as well, but it is salient in the fact that it is a untouched piece of ground that existed on the day of. And in Newfoundland history, the 1st of July holds a very, they call it, I believe, and my Newfoundland friends, I hope, will not pile on if I've misquoted this, Memorial Day in Newfoundland. And it's interesting that although Newfoundland is part of Canada now, it was not back then. The 1st of July is Canada's birthday. That's Canada Day. Mm-hmm. But in Newfoundland, it is remembered as Memorial Day, although they are now, as we are more than likely aware, part of Canada. So in Newfoundland, the Newfoundland Regiment has a battalion formed at the beginning of the war, and they go through a huge series of events and mobilization. They end up in Gallipoli, and they end up on the Western Front in a British division, as you would expect a colonial battalion to do so. They're not part of the Canadian Corps. They're not part of the Canadian establishment. And they are in the reserve trenches going into the attack on the 1st of July. I don't have the brigade and the division that they were part of. It escapes me right now. So I apologize for those that would be screaming right now saying they're part of this division. I have it somewhere. I just don't have it to mind.
Don't worry. We'll get it for the follow-up for those that can't wait. And if you're screaming at us, tell us on social media, damn it. Everybody relax. Well, it's okay.
Again, it escapes me. I know that they were part of the 29th Division, I believe it was. Which brigade, I can't remember. Anyway, they're in the reserve. So they are part of the second and third waves that are intended to push through once those initial battalions at the front, in the front jumping off trenches, finish their attack. And horribly, things go completely sideways in this part of the front. They would have witnessed and heard the mine on Hawthorne Ridge go off, and then the whistles, and the attack is then launched. The Germans are able to get their machine guns in action, and they then stop the attack dead. We talk about the communication and that piece of warfare of the era being, noticeably absent or deficient, maybe a better term. The order comes back through a series of runners and messages that they are then to push through and try and develop the attack to push it, get some momentum, and get across no man's land. And the Newfoundland Battalion moves forward up through their communication trenches, which, the fighting trenches are perpendicular or parallel to the Germans. But then to get between them, forward and back, there's a series of communication trenches, which are typically less structured. They zigzag in the same sort of degree, but they're intended to move forward and back, or even laterally, but they're not intended to be fought from. So they could be deeper without fire steps, and this kind of thing. But they try and navigate up these routes, because there's only a finite number of these trenches that lead to their front trenches of their portion of the line. And they find they can't, because it's clogged with casualties being moved back from the initial attack that has been repulsed or stopped in its tracks. There's a decision made by the battalion commander to then get up out of the trenches. We can't navigate through these communication trenches to get forward, to jump off on our attack. So they make the decision that they get out of their trenches and advance across open ground to try and mitigate this inability to get forward. And immediately they're caught by two machine guns in particular, and they suffer grievously. To this day, the front line is intact in its position on the ground. The trench is still there, obviously covered in grass and perhaps not quite as defined, but you can see the fire bays where they were dug and where they were jumped off from. And there's a tree that's about halfway across no man's land. And to this day, it's known as the danger tree. That has become synonymous within the fabric of the history of the Newfoundland Regiment as being the place at which the man who got furthest reached, halfway across no man's land, not close to the German line. I have taken the opportunity I've been there three times now. I have stood in the positions where these two machine guns in particular were, one of which is outside of the park in a farmer's field, but you can see how it dominated the ground that the Newfoundland Battalion advanced over and why it inflicted the casualties that it did. So this is perhaps, it was certainly in Canadian history as being as taken on Newfoundland history as well, is sort of one of these salient points that speaks to the greater understanding of the Great War. There's no doubt that the attack in that particular part of the front is defeated catastrophically. And I don't want to say the sacrifice of the Newfoundland Battalion, because it went forward beside other battalions that suffered similar fates. But they were destroyed essentially as a fighting unit, and other battalions next to them were as well. In that particular part of the front is perhaps where we get that stereotype of fighting on the Somme, especially the first day. That is that microcosm where that understanding comes from, because it was horrific, undeniably.
And we're talking only about 9 a.m. So this is only about an hour and a half into the fighting. This is a long day in and of itself, and there are hours to go. But like you're talking about the Newfies being cut down, and we're only 90 minutes into this fight. Right. So like that's just, it speaks just to the horror and the violence. I'm looking around, I'm surrounded by stat sheets that I made for myself, just because I spent so much time studying 1917 that I was like, oh crap, so there's some basics about 16 I need to have written down so I don't seem like a dummy. And as you're talking, I'm just like reading, and like things you're saying are on these sheets. And one of the things I wrote in my note to myself was the Newfoundland Regiment battalion is cut down. Like I use the terms cut down because it just seemed like that when as I was reading, that these guys just walked into an onslaught. And I don't say walked meaning the way we've sort of been, jabbing at that concept, but like that's the violence that these men went into. One of the Imperial War Museum stat sheets I have here says 90% of all of the first day casualties on the BEF were sustained due to these machine gun, positions you're talking about. And like, that's just mind numbing to me, is just walking into that kind of an attack. And you're talking about just, when specifically a moment ago, just 2 machine guns, and there are dozens, if not hundreds along this 18-mile front. So yeah, the negative stuff you hear about definitely doesn't come from nowhere. There was an overwhelming defense that was organized and in play, and the BEF was going right into the teeth of it.
Right. So, that moment between the barrage lifting and the Germans, it becomes a race to the parapet, essentially, which is why, and again, we're talking about the 36th Division, in their technique of crawling into no man's land as close to the German trenches as they could under the barrage, so that when it did lift it, they were right there. And others who took a more deliberate approach and had longer pieces or farther pieces of ground to cover, is that, the effect, they're not able to get to the German lines before the Germans are able to come out of their dugouts, place their machine guns back in their positions, and engage what they now see in front of them. Because the barrage off that trench is lifted, their trench is smashed and destroyed, and maybe some of the wire in front of them is also destroyed, but they've been relatively safe physically in their dugouts, now able to get out of their dugouts, bring their machine guns up with them and place them back in their positions, whether they're on a mount or just placed on top of the sandbags. But now in front of them, they see waves of men coming forward, and very much so, that is the general way that the troops were organized, is that they had the assaulting waves, and there were bombers included in that, what they called moppers up, who had the intent was that once the initial assault waves would pass over trenches, that the moppers up would further investigate, clear out bunkers that maybe got bypassed and that kind of thing. And then there was multiple waves of troops behind one another to then be able to take over the advance or reinforce places that people were held up at. There are examples, like we've already alluded to, of where that was modified to a technique or techniques that were deemed to be more effective. That said, remember, we're talking about a new army here, and the level of understanding and the level of tactical expertise varied greatly. If that battalion happened to have a veteran commander or veteran personnel in it at command levels that maybe understood things a bit better, they perhaps benefited from some of the advice and the direction that was given, the men that is, and the way they conducted their attack. But in a battalion that perhaps didn't, that perhaps their colonel and their company commanders and their sergeants, they joined maybe perhaps even with them in 1914. And it's just because they had an education, or maybe they stood out as being somebody that was apt to a captain of a rugby team or something like that, that they were generally understood to be better at leading people. And that's where they went, and they became leaders. But they've been in the army the same amount of time in the same unit. Maybe their skill set is being developed in a different way, but maybe in certain battalions that the general direction, the general tactical appreciation of how to do things is sort of accepted, and the imagination piece isn't perhaps as well developed. But again, there's so many layers to this, trying to pick it all apart. We're also in an army, and when you're in the army and you're told this is what you're going to do, I want you to organize this way because the entire division's doing the same thing, then, well, you're in the army. This is what we're doing. Guys, there's going to be a barrage. We're all going to line up. There's going to be 2 battalions in the first wave and 2 battalions of the brigade to support. And those lead battalions will adopt this formation because we're getting it out of our trenches. You guys are going to go to that junction of that trench over there, and you guys are going to head that way. Okay? This is what we're going to do. All right. Like, who am I to question it? I've never done anything like this before. And this is what we're being told to do as being the way to do it. So there's all kinds of nuances that we have to appreciate going on here that may speak to some of the local successes, but also to the local, difficulties and local defeats that happen, especially on that first day. It is undeniably a moment in history, in military history, in British military history. I say that in the greater context, that it's in the consciousness for a reason, because of its, I don't want to say overwhelming failure, but its high degree of failure. There are units that manage to achieve a modicum of success on the first day, but they are in the minority. So what we end up with are 57,000 casualties on the first day of a total of 12 divisions, and organized into 5 different corps in the Fourth Army. And each division, remember, has 12 infantry battalions plus the supporting artillery and et cetera, et cetera. So, if we just take the numbers, being these battalions are relatively up to strength, probably between 700 and 900 men. I wouldn't say they're at 1,000, but they haven't been ground down in a campaign yet. So they're still fairly strong. And there's 12 of them in each division. So, simple math, if we just say 12,000 infantry, 12,000 bayonets in each division times 12 divisions. That's how many men are committed, not in the first waves. There's supports and reserves that are held locally. That's not all those battalions in a single line moving forward. They're echeloned behind each other because the attack needs depth, right? We can't just send one group of people. We need to send a group of people behind them to support them and whatnot. But we are talking about huge groups of manpower moving across and trying to coordinate this. That tactical doctrine has been chosen to try and mitigate a perceived, perhaps, deficiency in the tactical ability of some of these new army formations. So we speak about, them being sort of like babies, lambs to the slaughter, that kind of thing. That is very kitschy, and I would certainly not default to statements like that. But when we talk about the relativity, that these are new army formations that have never been involved in anything like this before, and being launched into something so hugely complex, trying to be directed from a central sort of location, as the army is hierarchical. So how do we manage this? And I get the sense, especially when you read the history of the Somme, is that they arrive at a point that's sort of, we've just made it. We've just got to a point where we're comfortable in committing these divisions into the fight. Could we use another year to develop them all? Of course we could, but we don't have that year. We've got to the point, the French, we're under pressures on the international side, on the Western Front. The Verdun piece is playing a huge role in the impetus into getting this attack underway. Would it be better that these divisions were blooded in smaller actions to get more battle experience? Sure, no time.
Right.
They just can't. So we arrive at this sort of tactical sort of level of expertise that is not perfect. It may not even be, to the standard we would expect from other formations that have been out in France for longer. But it is certainly deemed as being it's good enough, and quite frankly, it's what we've got. So the weaponry that they're taking into the fight has improved to a degree as well. Trench warfare has brought about a number of things. The bomb is perhaps, at the individual infantryman level, is perhaps the one that's most easily associated with, because the bomb, the grenade bombing, and I think there was something to do with the Grenadier Guards not wanting to call people grenadiers, because only Grenadier Guardsmen were called grenadiers.
Right.
I kind of wondered about that, actually. I'm glad you made that point.
Mental system that probably bubbled up. Whether that's myth or not, I don't know. It sounds somewhat plausible, but
we are not the same. That's what they're saying.
The end result is that those that handle grenades are called bombers, and they use bombs. And the Mills bomb is the colloquial term used to describe it. They start off with prototypes and very small locally produced versions in the beginning of the war. But by 1916, the bomb has sort of arrived at a degree of maturity, but it's still somewhat of a specialist kind of thing, that there are specially trained men bombers exist within rifle companies within the battalion that are specially trained in those tactics. And they're the ones that are sort of, we need to bomb that trench up. We'll get some bombers up here, and they start throwing grenades. While the riflemen in the platoon will then go in there with their bayonets and their rifles. So this is something that is, I would say, arrived at a degree of maturity by the time of the Somme. The other piece is that machine guns. And early in 1915, they realized that in the case of the British Army, the Vickers machine gun, which is a version of a Maxim gun. So essentially the Vickers on the British side and the Maxim on the German side, they're essentially the same weapon. They're not mechanically, but they come from the same father, as it were. In British service, initially going into the war, there was 2 of those in each battalion in the machine gun section, and they were arguably underappreciated as weapons in terms of in the tactical construct. As the war develops, they realize that first that the complement of machine guns per battalion is increased to 4, and then they come to the decision that leads to the machine guns being pulled out of the infantry battalions, because they realize that we need better tactics, we need better organization, that just because this battalion has 4 machine guns and the commander says, I want them here, here, and here, is that the best place to put these really important weapons? What happens if we need 2 of those to go over there, because that particular piece of ground held by a different battalion needs more machine guns to protect it, or they have better arcs of fire or something like that? But how do we do this if that battalion commander owns those machine guns? He doesn't want to give them up. He wants them for his piece of the front. So what they end up doing is creating a whole other arm of service, the machine gun corps. And they pull the Vickers guns out of the infantry battalions and put them in new organizations in a separate entity, a machine gun battalion. And that will allow the more flexible deployment of the machine guns within a given area. As you might imagine, battalion commanders are furious, generally speaking, furious about this, because they've lost this huge asset that they have, that they use specifically in defense of their locations. So what comes about as a replacement for this, in the greater context, it's obviously an addition, but in the local context, it's a replacement 1-for-1. And not even that at first, is the Lewis gun. And the Lewis gun comes into play, and in the infantry battalions, it's sort of given as, well, we're taking the Vickers guns away, this tripod, heavy sort of machine gun, sustained fire, able to lay on fixed lines and all that kind of stuff. And here's the light machine gun, which essentially is like a lightweight automatic rifle with, you just pop it up on a bipod or on a sandbag and you fire away. And initially the Lewis gun is derided because it's seen in the context of the Vickers gun. It's like, this is something we want, and now you're replacing it with this? Like, no, this doesn't work. But eventually the Lewis gun begins to be incorporated more into the smaller unit tactical side of things. But by the time of the Somme, it hasn't arrived at its maturity yet. It's carried within the battalions, but it's still used in that kind of that same battalion machine gun section kind of role. I can't speak specifically to how many machine guns are in each battalion by the Somme. I want to say 8, sort of 2 per company, right? Which doesn't allow anything. In doing that, there's still company assets, and the company is 150 guys all spread out. So it hasn't arrived at that tactical maturity like you may have understood in 1917. And the way the Lewis gun evolves on the battlefield in its tactical use comes as a result of looking at the way it was used on the Somme and the evolution of the tactics going into 1917. And eventually the Lewis gun becomes the center of a platoon. And there's 1 in each platoon. And by the end of the war, there's even some instances where there's 2 in each platoon. So, but by the Somme, the Lewis gun is there, but it hasn't arrived at that level of tactical maturity yet as far as its use on the battlefield goes. And generally speaking, the only thing to add to the sort of the degree of weaponry brought to bear as these guys go over the top on the 1st of July are rifle grenades. I say rifle grenade, rifle bombs, which are the same sort of mill style bomb with a spigot attached to the end of it, a long a piece of metal, a rod that's then placed down the barrel of your rifle. And there's a sheet metal fitting that you clip to the front of your rifle that's affixed with the bayonet that cradles the grenade, holds the safety lever in place, so that the idea is you load a blank cartridge, this spigot goes down the barrel to create some pressure. You place the grenade in the holder with the safety lever held by the sheet metal, pull the pin, fire, it launches the grenade. Of course, it comes free of the holder, allowing the safety lever to fly off, starting the timer of 4.5 seconds or whatever it was, something about that. And then it flies out in the air and lands and explodes. So these are all new weapons that are coming and sort of take their place within the infantry on the first day of the Somme. In the case of the Newfoundland Battalion, is there much case to employ ranks of rifle bombers? You're trying to get forward in the face of overwhelming machine gun fire in places like that.
But certainly is getting attacked trying to get out of the car. I mean, that's sort of how I envision that. Is like they didn't even get their feet out of the door mostly,
and they have to have all this coming at them. Right. Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good way to put it, and that certainly would have happened in many spots along the line. Right. There's all kinds of potential, but it hasn't. All the pieces haven't matured yet. They've picked sort of a way to do business that they feel is the best, based on the material, the manpower, the level of experience, the maturity of the force, the maturity of the weaponry, the maturity of the techniques, the tactics. They pick a sort of set of a way to go forward, and they launch into it. And it doesn't meet its potential. It doesn't meet the expectation. And of course, as we are more than likely well aware, the ability to achieve their objectives on the first day of the Somme is very minimal.
Yeah. I want to focus on a few successes, because a lot of what we focus on the first day, whether it's in this conversation or as a whole, is on the negatives of the first day of the Somme for the BEF. But on my quick note sheet, one, you were correct when you were saying you were thinking it was the 36th Division. Yes, it was. One of the notes I wrote is, you're talking about their local command, I guess, having sort of a better, maybe tactical mindset about what they were up against. Their positioning and judgment going over the top has elements of their unit almost a mile behind certain parts of the German line an hour into the fight, because of just how much of the ground they didn't have to cover. They were able to get up and fight through the line. So the 36th has some successes on the first day. The 39th Division gets all the way to its paper final objectives. The 30th Division ends up capturing some significant places. Part of the 7th Division outflanks the entire village of Mametz for a while. The 46th Division arguably makes it pretty far in there. One of the things I wanted to talk about with, how did they, with the lack of communication, and how could they tell all these things in real time? One of the things I found interesting when I first started to study the Somme was that there's some really rudimentary technologies employed, in as far as communications. We always talk about carrier pigeons, and I always think about like Robin Hood and stuff like that. But some of these guys are wearing like polished pieces of metal on their back so that we can see the sun glinting off of them, and we can see, sort of roughly where they are. So it's just, there's so much going on in the negative stuff that there are units that have successes. There are ways to see some of these things in real time. Not all of them are accurate. I think at one point Rawlinson thinks he's got an overall breakthrough based on what he's being told, but that's obviously not true. But there are a ton of units. The 63rd and the 21st Division both have successes on the field. But, I think I've listed less than 10 divisions right there, and there's obviously so many more divisions involved in this. So the first day, obviously a pretty terrible experience. I think out of the 57,000 casualties, it's slightly under 20,000, somewhere between 19,000 and 20,000 dead outright on the field, I believe, if that's correct. And, taking that back to the last World War I chat we had, where we sort of talked about the worst day in French military history, the Battle of the Frontiers kicking off. That's 27,000 dead in a single day, 70,000 casualties. And of course, comparing that to the American Civil War, our worst day, single day in American military history is the Battle of Antietam, and that's 23,000 casualties with roughly 4,000 to 6,000 dead. So, we're talking about these astronomical battles and casualty counts, that, just dwarf everything that we sort of focus on here in this country. And then the last thing is to sort of, because I know I'm jumping all over the place with that, but you mentioned the Lewis gun. The other day I sent Matt a video. It was the first time I'd ever seen this. I saw a guy in a training scenario just firing a Lewis gun from like the hip. And one of the things in my Canadian research at Vimy is, part of the lessons these guys had learned is there are guys being effective carrying their Lewis guns, firing from the hip as they're advancing on Vimy Ridge and things like that. And I was always like, I wonder what that looks like. And I finally got to see this video of this dude firing a Lewis gun, and it almost knocked him over. And I was like, wow, it's not a slouch weapon. So, when these guys are, pissed that their Vickers rifles or Vickers guns are being taken away, I'm like, why don't be totally mad, guys. The century of hindsight I have says that's a pretty badass weapon, because that guy looked pretty big, fired it, and almost took him right off his feet. Why fire from the hip? That's the other question.
After the Somme is over, it just did sort of dwell on the Lewis gun piece as it relates to the greater tactical sort of paradigm, as it were. After the Somme, obviously, it turns into a titanic struggle. We've just talked about the first day in the most cursory of ways, and without getting into the weeds of the individual division actions and whatnot. But after the Somme is over and everyone is essentially exhausted, in terms of not only physical, the troops are exhausted, but the divisions are all there. By the end of it, there's 53 infantry divisions, British and Empire infantry divisions that cycle through the Somme, 12 on the first day. And those 12 sort of have that first effort, but the battle progresses, as we are well aware, all the way through the summer and into the fall and into the beginnings of winter. 53 divisions go through that. So when they say that everyone's exhausted, the army is spent to the point where our gains, the weather's completely changed now. We can't get forward anyway. Things are becoming such. And as all battles do, eventually it just peters out. And that's what happens. Almost immediately, people start thinking, all right, once we launched into this, there's very little time, as we see when we get through the rest of the battle, is that there's very little time for navel gazing to say, let's study what happened last week, and maybe we'll take a few weeks and sort it out, and we'll come up with a new solution, and we'll try it something differently. No, we can't do that. We have to keep pushing, because if we stop, the Germans are going to take advantage of that. They're going to either dig in quicker, have more in place by the time we do get our act together and make another attack. We need to get someone else in there. The momentum, we have to try and maintain that. So there's no time for sort of retroactively looking at and developing that the learning piece as they're going through. There's local tactical learning going on, but in terms of that overall army level, tactical learning, there's very little time for it. But after the Somme happens, immediately there's all kinds of talk initiated with the French. What did you guys do at Verdun? What was successful for you? And there's like an envoy. And I speak to this specifically because the Canadians are involved in that whole process. And Curry, who later becomes our corps commander after Vimy Ridge, he is part of that, visiting and trying to glean out and learn some lessons in this sort of lull that exists over the wintertime. And part of that aspect comes in and is digested by the BEF as a whole. And there is a real paradigm shifting event that occurs in the publication of SS 143, which is a training manual that comes as a result of the lessons that were learned on the Somme, the lessons that our envoys, if you will, learn from the French and their tactics, their small unit tactics. And what this manual prescribes is the genesis of what we would consider now to be modern platoon tactics. which never existed before. We spoke earlier about the density of Lewis guns within a given unit. There aren't that many, so we can't make, what ends up happening is the platoon becomes its own little army. The platoon has a machine gun now, which it never had before. The platoon has rifle bombers in it, which are sort of like mini artillery, if you want to call it that. We have riflemen, and we have bombers who are really good at throwing bombs. So between those four entities, the platoon gets reorganized moving into 1917. And that first sort of use of this new tactical approach is done in 1917 at Arras, and Vimy Ridge being part of the greater Battle of Arras. So that's a little Canadian piece there. It's not driven by the Canadians, but we're part of it, because by 1917, we have a corps in the field, 4 divisions. That our 4 divisions are in the field on the Somme in the latter part. They don't fight all at once, all at the same time, but the Canadian Corps is there, 4 divisions strong, coming out of the Somme. And where do they go after that? They get put in the line in front of Vimy, and they have months and months and months to prep for an attack there.
Yeah,
the lessons that are learned on the Somme play hugely significant roles into the success at Vimy and Arras. Arras is often derided as being an unsuccessful attack. But if you look at it from the context of, well, it didn't achieve a breakthrough, so therefore it must be unsuccessful. Okay, so every attack is unsuccessful because there was never a breakthrough.
I look at it like the Canadians held up their part of the deal. That's how I look at that when I study that.
Sure. But if you look at the rest of the Battle of Arras, there was huge gains made in the south in front of the town, right? These tactics were put in place across the BEF and were used with success. And they arrive at full maturity in 1918, especially once open warfare happens. But they're used at Passchendaele, they're used in other places, they're used at Cambrai, all these other places. This platoon level emphasis comes out of fighting on the Somme. So a bit of a tactical, a bit of a rabbit hole as we talk about the organization and the weaponry and the way they fought and this kind of stuff. Admittedly, off the topic a little bit, but it's important that this is an example of what we talked about at the beginning, which was this bridging point in the war, is that the army has arrived at this size, this mature size in terms of numbers of divisions. It can undertake a huge operation, the first of its kind, and it just gets better at it as the war progresses. And that doesn't mean to say that places at battles like Third Ypres or what's become known as Passchendaele, I'm not trying to say that those were without all the horrific aspects that they hold. But if we look at it from that learning process, that there are hugely significant tactical understandings that are gained and changes that are made to try and increase that learning process, get that one step above your enemy. But it just goes right up until the collapse of the German army at the end of the war. It becomes, the whole aspect of it is just, in the greater picture, it is attritional.
Well, let's do this, because I think that I want to talk specifically, not tonight. I think I want to start winding this down because we've had a really good chat tonight, and there's things I want to talk about with sort of the results, the aftermath. You talk about how this all leads into, the 1917 and 1918, where this sort of becomes, perfected and stuff like that. To me, the Somme is one of the beginnings of the end. I use this terminology a lot in the American Civil War, where you have, and I say this all the time just to get under the skin of people that study the Battle of Gettysburg, ad nauseum, is that the real high watermark of the Confederacy is Antietam. From there, everything starts to progressively become downhill. There are moments and things like that, but, after the Somme, it's not too long that, we get into Operation Albright, and, the Germans are falling back on their Hindenburg line, which essentially becomes the line for the end of the war. So we're leaving the conversation because what I want to do is I want to leave it at the end of July 1st. And then when we pick up in the follow-up, I'd like to talk just a little bit about two of the actions that take place in the overall campaign. I want to talk about some of the fighting at Thiepval. And then because I do like to study the Canadians a lot, I wanted to get into Fleurs Courcelette because obviously there's a huge Canadian involvement there. Things like that. So I want to kind of maybe pick that up from there. We'll have some listener questions we'll get into, but this is the beginning of what becomes, in my mind, the end phase of the war. And I know people break down the war differently, but part of being a student is having things make sense to you, like have it make sense to you, not just the way somebody's explaining it to you. So for me, when I started to study the Somme, I was like, we're starting to position ourselves for what becomes the final acts of the war. They play out over the course of almost 2 years. But, when this campaign ends, the Verdun lectures are being done. You talked about that with Curry and a lot of these other command staff going and listening to the French leaders, talking about what they learned, what was successful for them. And all of these lessons combined with this, I don't want to say retreat in the way that people think, but it's a military consolidation of forces that the Germans do in like over the winter 16-17. But this campaign, this battle, this day, this campaign is all sort of positioning the beginning of the big final act. And there's a lot that happens in that big final act, but that's just sort of how my brain wraps around the Somme, is that while all this is going on and we're at the halfway point, we're in the middle of all these things, we're still sort of positioning ourselves to a very long and bloody end. And it's wild that happens in 1916 for a war that ends in 18, similarly to the way I discuss it with you, Matt, often that, things start to go downhill for the Confederacy in 1862, as far as a war that ends in 1865. So when we talk about the complexities of this, that's one of the reasons we decided for this conversation not to get totally down into the unit and regimental and battalion level weeds, is because we would spend hours and hours and hours here. And we've spent almost 3 hours talking right now, and we're just wrapping up July 1st, the first day. And one of the things we intended on doing was not just focusing on the first day, because that seems to be what a lot of people do. And it's easy to do that, right? Like 60,000 casualties, it's harder for us to identify with 70,000 French casualties than it is with 60,000, 57,000 British casualties, because we speak this language. We speak the BEF language and things like that. So we don't really get plugged into, the Battle of the Frontiers and that experience. But for some reason in this country, we all, in the very limited First World War knowledge and experience we get, people always seem to hover around. They know about July 1st and they know how terrible of a day it was. Which is why I think with the way we've had the conversation, it's actually good to wrap it up here. That way we can take a break, because I need a break, man. The Western Front wears me out, Matt. Matt can tell you, I was struggling when we were following the French for a while, but I do want to focus on some of the other things, and I don't want to take away from there, because the Battle of the Somme is really a campaign that lasts 4 months, and it features dozens of these little battles. Like I'm looking at a map here you could talk about small battles at Metz, Poitiers, Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel, Courcelette, things like that. Montauban. These are all like small little villages that are fought over that could almost be described as their own battle. Vimy is a battle I've brought up a lot in 1917. Well, that's its own little battle in the larger Battle of Arras. So what I'd like to do is when we get together in a couple weeks, I want to talk a little bit about Thiepval, just because that's one of the more famous fights in the Battle of the Somme. And because I know that you're a Canadian, I want to talk a little bit about the Canadians on the Somme, because everybody knows I have an affinity for the Maple Leaf. Unless it's hockey. I'm still mad about Sidney Crosby way back. Just want to put that out there. Just some things you never get over in life. Bastard. But so Rob, just for our listeners who've been hanging out with us thus far and don't want to wait until we do our follow-up, what's a good way for our listeners to catch up with you and British Muzzleloaders?
So obviously the channel is on YouTube, and for the time being, there are a couple of places where I have other videos that YouTube doesn't like ammunition videos and stuff, but all the links to those are found on the main channel. And the channel also has a Facebook page. So the links to that are in every video. If you check the the channel out on YouTube, you'll see the link to the Facebook page there. And for those that are feeling generous and enjoy the work that is put on the channel and wish to help support the channel, and quite frankly, without the support that I get through Patreon and the patrons thereon, the channel would not really exist. So if that's something that people wish to see and help out with, that is most appreciated. But essentially that I'm not a big, huge social media footprint, the Instagram and the Twitter and all that stuff. I just don't have time. But certainly a Googling of British muzzleloaders, or Googling Baker rifle, or Googling Mad Minute, or Googling P53 Enfield will probably get you there to some degree in either videos or comments that I've made and something like that. For sure that the channel on YouTube is the go-to place though.
I just want to say, first of all, we'll do our absolute best to help our listeners find their way to you. You can use our social medias as well. Obviously, you can follow us on ours at Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube by searching the History Things podcast. We'll get links to British Muzzleloaders up everywhere on there. Like Rob said, you can just search for British Muzzleloaders or a multitude of other things. You could also, I will say, search sweet mustaches, but that might not get you the search you want. But what I was going to say is, in the pantheon of fantastic mustaches, there's like Selleck, Sam Elliott, and now you, my man. Like that is bravo. So no, I had a great time tonight. Thanks for hanging out with us. This is my mission in life, is to connect people with stories and get them to sort of understand what happened. And unfortunately, I think when you start that conversation with some of the really high detailed stuff, like following like the 85th Battalion every step of the way across Vimy Ridge, I think you lose a lot of the people unless you lose an opportunity to teach. And this was an amazing step into what is one of the worst campaigns of a war, full of terrible campaigns, and the worst day in British military history, and things like that. So I personally, I can't speak for Matt, but I am super grateful that you spent some time with us tonight. And all that. So Matt, you got any final words before we go ahead and get out of here for the evening, mate?
No, absolutely. Rob, thank you very much for joining us this evening. The work you've done on British Muzzleloaders is fantastic. I've really enjoyed your work on there and encourage our listeners to definitely check that out and support if you can. Our discussion tonight has really gone into some great detail in fairly broad strokes. Like Pat said, we're not getting down necessarily into the deepest of weeds, but we still went down some really interesting rabbit holes, got some great information from you, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to you again when we continue the rest of the story for the Battle of the Somme.
All right, so I always like to get out of here on a really serious note, Rob. I'm a Rangers fan. My co-host here is a Red Wings fan. Do you have an NHL affiliation?
Right. Well, I'm from British Columbia.
Oh, so 1994 is a sore year for you.
Yeah. I would preface all that with saying hockey is much better played than watched.
I would agree. Having never played, I always imagine it's much more fun than the joy I get watching, and I love watching. So,
yes. Well, I like a good hockey game. I would like to say that although I have a almost by default sense of loyalty, it is quite that. And one day the Canucks will get there.
Yeah, not if the Rangers have anything to say about it. So anyway, I appreciate you hanging out with us. Thank you all for listening to the History Things podcast. We're halfway through our third season, our third trip around the sun, doing this crazy history adventure. We appreciate you sticking around with us. For our guest, Rob from British Muzzleloaders, for my co-host, Matt Borders, author, historian, and park ranger. I didn't do that at the beginning. Who am I slacking here? What is wrong with me? I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire. This has been the History Things podcast saying thank you so much. We will see you in the follow-up later.